The morning my father decided to have me killed, he did it the polite way, with a title, a smile, and a hall full of witnesses who all agreed I had it coming. June 7th Prince, Xiaoren, approach and pay your respects. That was the eunuch outside the Golden Luan Hall screeching my name like it had personally insulted his ancestors. I hadn't even reached the doors yet, and I could already feel the stares landing on me from inside. Cold ones. The kind of cold you get from people who've spent 10 years deciding you shouldn't exist and are annoyed you keep proving them wrong by, breathing. Let me set the scene for you because the scene is the whole joke. I'm the 7th prince of the Baeksuan dynasty. Sounds fancy. It is not. My mother was the eldest princess of Ruran, married into the imperial family to seal an alliance, and she gave the emperor a son with slightly too sharp cheekbones and a bloodline the court could never quite stomach. Then Ruran rebelled when I was 6. And just like that, my mother went from Her Highness to that foreign woman, to a name nobody said out loud, dying alone in the cold palace while the whole court exhaled in relief. And me? I became the family stain, the walking apology. For 10 years, the vocabulary aimed at me was really economical. 3 words, on rotation. Bastard. Foreign blood. Bastard again, but with feeling. So when I walked into that hall and saw my 6 older brothers lined up like a row of very well-dressed knives, and the civil officials suddenly finding the ceiling fascinating, and my father up on the 9-dragon throne looking at me the way you look at a stain you're finally about to scrub out, I knew. Whatever was coming, it was going to be dressed up as a promotion. Your subject pays respects to your majesty. I bowed, voice smooth, not a ripple. I'd had a decade of practice keeping my face this empty. No need for formalities. Father's voice could have frozen the tea. Renair, I've called you here to announce something. Here it comes. The southern wilderness is vast and sparsely populated and in dire need of a firm hand. Considering that you are of age, it is time you shared the burdens of the court. From this day, you will depart for the southern wilderness and take up your fief, and every official in that hall smiled the exact same smile. You know the one. The smile people make at a funeral when they didn't like the deceased, because here's what the southern wilderness actually was. Choking miasma that put men in the ground with fever, 5 local warlords who ate imperial governors for breakfast and didn't bother wiping their mouths, and the southern Li dynasty sitting right on the border, riding across every autumn to burn villages, steal grain, and leave. Last month alone, their cavalry sacked 3 border cities. Every governor father had ever sent down there came home in a box or didn't come home at all, so this wasn't a fief. This was an execution with a scenic route. I opened my mouth to accept my death sentence like a good boy, and that's when a voice went off inside my skull. Ding! Daily check-in system loading. I did not move a single muscle in my face. 10 years of practice, remember, but inside I nearly swallowed my own tongue. Loading complete. System description. The host may check in once per day and randomly receive either a 1,000-strong army or a renowned general or an advisor. I want you to sit with that for a second because I had to. Check in once a day, get 1,000 trained elite soldiers. Or a famous general or a strategist. Once a day. Do you have any idea what it takes to raise 1,000 soldiers in this world? 3 to 5 years of training, mountains of grain, weapons, provisions, sergeants who don't die of dysentery. And this thing was offering to hand me 1,000 of them like a merchant tossing free samples. That's not faster than the imperial army. That's faster than a sow having piglets, and a sow doesn't even ask for armor. 30,000 elite troops a month, plus generals, plus advisors, and they were sending me with this to the one corner of the empire nobody was watching. To die. I nearly laughed. I'd have loved to laugh. But if I'd laughed right then, in front of my father, on the day he sentenced me to death, they'd have chalked it up to me finally cracking, and honestly, that would have wasted a perfectly good laugh. So I just bowed lower. Your subject obeys the decree, and will do his utmost to govern the southern wilderness well. Father's eyes flicked over me. I watched a little sliver of contempt cross them. He'd expected me to rage, to beg, to at least go pale. Instead, the Ruran bastard just folded. Easy as laundry. It confirmed everything he already believed. Weak, spineless. No wonder the other 6 never took me seriously. Perfect. Believe that. Believe that with your whole chest. Excellent, he boomed, all warmth now, playing the generous father for the crowd. As expected of my 7th son, such courage. I hereby grant you the title Prince of Nan'an. The southern wilderness is yours. Then, because a good murder has to look like a favor, he turned to the hall. My ministers, what number of troops would be appropriate for Prince Nanan? The Minister of War stepped out before the echo died. Li Jin. 2nd Prince's dog. Everybody knew it. Your Majesty, the southern wilderness is quite stable at present. 1,000 elite soldiers should more than suffice. 1,000. To hold a region 5 warlords and a foreign dynasty couldn't be pried out of. He might as well have handed me a spoon and told me to go dig my own grave, save everyone the trouble. The Minister of Rights frowned and tried to argue for 30,000, bless him. Old Zhao Ming was the one man in that hall who occasionally remembered I had a pulse. But Li Zhen just sneered him down, and everybody knew the vote was rigged before it started, because whatever number they gave me, half of them would be father's spies anyway. So when the emperor turned to me and asked, all silk, 7th prince, do you find 1,000 soldiers sufficient? I decided to have a little fun. Father, I said, and I let my eyes go bright and eager, a puppy who'd just been told he's going to the fun farm. I need not take a single soldier of the courts. 300 guards from my own household will do. Once I reach the southern wilderness, I'll recruit the common folk and train an army myself. Legion nearly choked, trying not to laugh out loud. 300 men. Against warlords with thousands each and Southern Lee's iron cavalry. This boy was either genuinely stupid or pretending, and either way he'd lose his head before he found the front gate. Up on the throne, Father's eyes gleamed with pure satisfaction. Useless, exactly as advertised. Very well, since you are so determined, I grant it. 300 men, no army, no court spies riding along in my ranks, eating my food and counting my breaths. Just 300 people who were actually mine, and a system in my head that printed soldiers like the mint-printed coins. I bowed one more time to hide my face because I could feel the corner of my mouth wanting to move. And let me tell you, the day is not far off, Father, when I've walled up a foothold down south and drilled 1,000,000 men, and you come to understand exactly which of your sons you should have worried about. Enjoy the smiling. Smile all you like. You've got a few good months of it left. Thank you for your grace, Father Emperor. The whole way out of that hall, I could feel old Zhao Ming's eyes on my back. When I glanced up at him, I let one cold little smile slip, just for a heartbeat, just for him. I watched it land. Watched his face do the thing where a man realizes the boy he's been quietly pitying might not need his pity at all. Yeah, chew on that. I'd barely made it down the palace path. When the system decided it wanted to chat, ding, 5 hours and 26 minutes until today's check-in. Good, very good. Let the drama start in the southern wilderness. Besides the daily check-in, I asked it, keeping my lips still, what else do you do? The host has not yet reached the fief. System functions are in their initial state. Tsk. If only you'd shown up sooner. If I'd been awakened the day I transmigrated into this mess, I wouldn't have spent all these years getting sneered at by eunuchs. Ha! What are you saying, host? If I'd come earlier, you'd never have been sent to the southern wilderness at all. I stopped walking. Meaning? Meaning nothing. I just felt the timing was perfect. Once you take up your fief, I'll gradually open city construction. You'll build cities, develop the people, and the shop will start offering resources. The check-in is just the appetizer. An appetizer. The thing that could hand me 30,000 elites a month was the appetizer. So, it added, in the bright little tone I would come to know and despise, sometimes a loss turns out to be a blessing in disguise. Stop. I actually said it out loud, quietly, to the empty path. Of everything in this world, I hate cheerful nonsense the most. Hey, isn't this 7th brother? And of course. I turn a corner, and there's the 3rd prince, Xiao Rui, lounging against a pillar with a handful of guards, wearing the smirk of a man who thinks he's about to be entertained. Greetings, 3rd imperial brother, I said, bowing exactly as much as protocol required and not 1 degree more. Ha! He pushed off the pillar and drifted closer, dropping his voice to that fake concerned register bully's love. 7th brother is a man of real courage, 300 men, all the way to the southern wilderness. But little brother, those warlords down there keep some very rough company. Do you really think 300 will be enough to fill their teeth? Thank you for your concern, 3rd brother. I smiled, small and pleasant. But however treacherous the southern wilderness may be, I imagine it's still more honorable than certain people who spend all day scheming against their own brothers. His face dropped a few degrees. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing at all. I looked him dead in the eye. Only, worry about yourself, 3rd brother. The struggle for the throne isn't a game for the careless. Then I clasped my hands, turned, and left him standing there with a face the color of old liver. I didn't have to look back to know what he was doing, leaning to his guard, hissing an order, keep eyes on him. Once he's clear of the capital, send men to escort him on his way. That last bit with a little smile, because in this family, escort him on his way has never meant make sure he arrives safely, which was fine, genuinely, because if Xiao Rui could have seen my face right then, he wouldn't have looked half so pleased with himself. The game had only just begun, and I was the only one at the table who could see the board. I found out later, from people who were in the room, how the rest of my family spent that evening, and it's worth telling because it's the exact flavor of the thing I was leaving. They gathered at the Yong'an Palace, my brothers, the Crown Prince Xiao Qiang pouring tea like a man who owns the seasons, the others draped around the room feeling clever, and they toasted me. Toasted my death, I mean. 300 men to the southern wilderness. Isn't that just asking for it? Xiaoqiang let them run for a while, then set his cup down and told them the part they didn't know, that Ma Kai, the man who really ran Southern An, was his creature, 5,000 elite under him, and full authority from the crown prince to make the useless seventh brother die of something convenient. What do you think he'll do? My big brother asked, with that half-blood good-for-nothing and his 300 guards? And the whole room laughed. Only my sixth brother, Xiao Wei, who watched more than he talked, said the thing nobody wanted to hear. Aren't you afraid, big brother, that a cornered dog might jump the wall? And Xiaoqiang waved it off. Him? He doesn't even deserve to be a cornered dog. I've thought about that line a lot since. He doesn't even deserve to be a cornered dog. It's a very expensive thing to say about a man you've decided not to watch. The Liu family had a worse evening. Li Meiling went home to her grandfather in tears with my handprint on her cheek and my thanks ringing in her ears, and the story she told him was not the story of what happened. It never is in that family. Grand Commandant Li Tao, hearing that a Ruran bastard had struck and humiliated the granddaughter of the second most powerful man in the empire, went the color of a storm cloud and rode to the palace to demand my head. And my father, this is the part I love, my father heard him out, agreed the seventh prince's conduct was appalling, and then declined to do a single thing about it. Because why would he? He'd already sent me to die. Let the boy have his little tantrum, the southern wilderness will handle the rest. So the old fox went home swallowing his rage, and did the only thing left to a proud man who can't get official satisfaction. He sent unofficial satisfaction down the road after me, in the shape of 300 hard men and a lie about his granddaughter's honor. Which is how the Blood Fiend camp ended up in those hills, but I've already told you how that went. I hadn't even reached my own front gate yet, and I already had the crown prince, the third prince, and the grand commandant all quietly spending men on my grave. It should have frightened me. It didn't. Because every one of them was making the same mistake in the same shape, and the shape was this. They were all planning the death of a boy who no longer existed, and none of them had noticed the door in the bottom of the hole. Back at my mansion, and I use the word mansion loosely because next to my brother's palaces, it looked like a servant's outbuilding that had wandered off and gotten lost. The first person I sent for was Elder Kai. Kai Quan, my steward. An old man who'd watched me grow from a scared 6-year-old into whatever I was now, and one of maybe 3 people in the entire capital who'd ever been kind to me without wanting something for it. When Ruran fell and the whole household started treating me like a ghost that hadn't finished dying, Elder Kai just kept bringing me my meals, kept teaching me to read, kept calling me, Your Highness, like he meant it. Elder Kai. I let my face do something it almost never did in public, soften. Go and select 300 guards. We leave immediately. Where to, Your Highness? The southern wilderness. He nearly dropped the teapot. What, Your Highness? The southern wilderness is a dragon's den, a tiger's lair. 8 of every 10 officials the court has ever sent there died in the ground. I know. Then why, how could His Majesty? He couldn't even finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We both knew how His Majesty could. They're trying to kill me, Elder Kai, I said, easy as remarking on the weather. That's the whole plan. There's no misunderstanding to clear up. Then why go at all? We could? And if I don't go? I asked gently. I disobey an imperial decree. Then they don't have to be clever about it. Then it's just a rope and a reason. I shook my head. No, we go. Trust me, Elder Kai. 300 is enough. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something happen behind that old man's eyes. Some quiet decision that whatever this boy had turned into while nobody was looking, he was going to follow it. Then this old servant will go and prepare, he said, bowing. The guards, how should I choose them? The most loyal ones you can find. My voice dropped. This journey is going to get bloody before it gets anywhere. I don't want a single man at my back who might be at my throat. This old servant understands. I'd just watched him shuffle out when a house servant announced my next visitor, and I swear the timing was so perfect I almost thanked the heavens for it. Miss Li Meiling, my fiancée. Let me explain Li Meiling because she is a small masterpiece of everything wrong with this family. Her grandfather is Grand Commandant Li Tao, one of the most powerful men in the empire, and the specific man who, years ago, stood up in that same golden Luan hall and argued, again and again, that a concubine of Ruran blood was a disgrace to the imperial house and ought to be stripped of her rank. That campaign is a large part of why my mother spent her last years weeping in a cold room until her heart gave out. And then, once she was safely dead, old Li Tao had a wonderful idea. Marry his granddaughter to the grieving little bastard. Look how magnanimous the Liu family is. Look how they hold no prejudice against Ruran blood. What a beautiful, generous gesture, and what a convenient way to bury the whole affair. So Li Meiling came to me preloaded with contempt, and she'd never bothered to hide it. I'd heard every Ruran mongrel she'd ever muttered where she thought I couldn't hear. And I'd also heard through the walls of a palace where everyone gossips exactly how much time she'd been spending making eyes at my second brother. She swept in, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that hadn't touched a single real tear, and gave me a curtsy so shallow it was basically an insult with knees. Greetings, seventh prince. I have something I'd like to tell you. Sit, I said, and put down my tea. Speak. I heard your highness is departing for the southern wilderness to take up his fief. Her voice did a little tremble, it had clearly rehearsed. But I haven't been well of late. The physician says I need rest, and the southern wilderness, with all its miasma, I'm afraid I simply couldn't. She peeked up under her lashes to gauge my expression, the way you check if a joke landed. My expression, I'm sorry to report, had not moved. She'd wanted rage or heartbreak. She got a man watching a play he's already read. So, I said, tilting my head, you're not planning to come with me. This is only for now, she wept, prettily. Once I'm well again, I'll surely come to the southern wilderness to be at your highness's side. Is that so? I set my cup down and let the smile finally reach my mouth. And when exactly would that be, Miss Liu? After I've died in the southern wilderness? Or after you've married my second brother? The handkerchief froze mid-dab. Her whole pretty grieving fiancé face cracked straight down the middle. How could you? Please. I stood and let her feel the height difference for the first time. You think I don't know about you and second brother? The two of you have been about as subtle as a gong. You came here today to squirm out of a corpse's engagement, and honestly, I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to marry me either, if I were as small a person as you are. Her face went from white to scarlet. The tears were gone. What was left was the real Li Meiling, the one under the theater. You, a lowly roaring mongrel, how dare you? I slapped her. Once. Clean. It rang across the hall. She staggered, hand to her cheek, staring at me like the furniture had bitten her, the granddaughter of the Grand Commandant, struck by a bastard prince. In her whole coddled life, I don't think anyone had ever told her no with their whole hand before. That one, I said very quietly, was for my mother, whom your grandfather hounded into her grave and then had the gall to wrap me and his family like a bandage over the wound he made. You dare. As for our engagement, I picked up a sheaf of papers from the table. I'd had a servant fetch them the moment she was announced because I do like to be prepared, and I let them fall open where she could see. Love letters, in her hand, to my second brother. It's astonishing what a few taels of silver will pry out of a homesick maid. It's dissolved. Consider yourself free, and do give your grandfather my warmest regards. Tell him the Ruran bastard sends his thanks for a decade of the family's kindness. Tell him I intend to repay every ounce of it. I called for the servants. Miss Liu is leaving. See her out. She left shaking. Not with grief now, but with the pure, incandescent fury of a proud woman who has just been made to feel small in front of witnesses, clutching her own letters, a red handprint blooming on her cheek. She'd walked in, expecting to enjoy watching me flinch. She walked out publicly humiliated, engagement broken, secret in the open, and every servant in my household would have the story halfway across the capital by nightfall. Which, for a family like the Lius, is worse than a knife. A knife you can bleed and heal. Lost face just festers. Kai Quan, I said once she was gone. Your Highness, send word, we depart at noon. A little cold light in my eyes now. They all want to watch me make a fool of myself on the road out. Fine, let's give them a good show. Ding, 1 hour and 12 minutes until today's check-in. The Liu family, I thought, listening to that carriage rattle away in a fury. That's just the interest. The principal comes later. By noon, the whole east gate of the capital was packed, not with well-wishers, with an audience. Word had gone around that the useless prince was riding off to die, and apparently nobody wanted to miss the last show. Look, that's the seventh prince, off to the southern wilderness. 300 men? Might as well hand himself to the warlords with a bow on. I heard the chiefs down there keep tens of thousands each. My little procession rolled out through all of it. My carriage in front, 50 guards aside on horseback, a dozen carts of daily supplies, the rest of my 300 strung out in a line that a stiff breeze could have scattered. Elder Kai rode alongside me looking like a man attending his own son's funeral, and I let him. Behind us, up on the city wall, I knew my brothers were watching, sipping tea, placing bets on which stretch of road I'd die on. Let them watch. The best part of the whole trip was that I was going to disappear off the edge of their map, and by the time I came back onto it, it would be far too late for any of them to do anything about it except sweat. Elder Kai, I said out the carriage window, stop looking like that. There's no need to worry. He gave me a wry old smile. After all these years, he still couldn't figure out how I always knew what he was thinking. This old servant has been overthinking things. We rolled south. Jingzhou behind us, then Yuzhou, then Yangzhou, the country going rougher and poorer under the wheels. And somewhere around the middle of the second day, the sun climbed to noon, and the voice in my head chimed the chime I'd been waiting for since the throne room. Ding, it is noon. The host may check in. Oh, I'd been looking forward to this. I closed the carriage curtain, leaned back and thought, check in. Check in successful. Please choose one. Army. 1,000 elite troops from Chinese history, quality 1 to 5 stars. General E, a famous general, 1 to 5 stars. Advisor. A strategist, 1 to 5 stars. Note, the first 3 check-ins are guaranteed 3 stars or above. So this was the banner. And like any veteran of pulling on banners, my first thought was extremely practical. A general with no soldiers is a very handsome man standing in a field. In the southern wilderness, with warlords stacked to the ceiling, what I needed first was bodies with weapons. I'll take the army. Congratulations, host. You have obtained 5-star army, the Tiger Brave Army. 1,000 men. I'll be honest with you. I sat up. 5 stars. On the very first pull, the Tiger Brave Army, the personal guard of the Martial Emperor of Han, one of the deadliest imperial units that ever drew breath. Men who struck terror into whole armies, and 1,000 of them had just been mailed to me like a parcel. Where do they appear? I asked, trying to sound calm and absolutely not sounding calm. You may specify any location within 2 kilometers to deploy. We were rolling through low hills. There was a grove of trees off to the left, maybe 2 miles out. Put them there, in the trees. Deploying. Deployment complete. 1,000 Tiger Brave soldiers await the host's command at the designated location. Your Highness! Elder Kai's voice, suddenly sharp, from up on his horse. Something is wrong ahead. There's a sound from the woods on the left. Yeah, that'd be my 1,000 5-star ghosts. The guards heard it too and closed up around the carriage, weapons out. I lifted the curtain, perfectly relaxed. No need to panic. Elder Kai, come with me. Let's take a look. Your Highness, that's far too dangerous. But I was already down and walking into the trees, and he had no choice but to follow with 50 of the guards, muttering prayers the whole way. We reached the edge of the grove, and every single one of them stopped dead. 1,000 men in heavy black armor stood in perfect formation, the light going cold and dull off the dragon crest on their chests, beast-faced helmets, bronze shields in the left hand, ring pommel swords in the right. The air around them felt heavier, like the grove had grown a spine. The moment I stepped clear of the trees, all 1,000 dropped to one knee at once. Greetings, my lord. It went off like thunder. Birds shot out of the canopy in every direction. Elder Kai actually took a step back. Every man of them was 8 feet tall, shoulders like door lintels, eyes like drawn knives. Their armor was heavier than the imperial guards and somehow lighter on them, and old Lin, who'd spent 40 years around soldiers, just stood there with his mouth open because he'd never in his life seen 1,000 men this dangerous kneel to anybody, let alone to the boy the whole court had written off as a joke. My lord, the lead centurion barked, fist to chest. We swear to serve you unto death. I let myself enjoy it for exactly 1 breath. Then I turned to Elder Kai, who looked like his brain had left to lie down somewhere quiet. Elder Kai, there's no need to be surprised. Your Highness, this army. Now, here's the thing. I obviously couldn't tell him a magic voice in my head had just printed 1,000 imperial guards out of the noon air, so I'd had a cover story ready since the throne room. I touched the green jade at my belt, a pendant my mother had left me before she died. You remember this jade? It wasn't ordinary. It was a legacy token of the Ruran royal house. I let the story unspool, smooth and sad and just true enough. My mother knew what my life in the palace would become. Before she died, she left a contingency, an elite force, cultivated in secret, to be summoned the day I came of age. This is her last gift to me. I watched it settle over him, watched the old man's eyes fill up, because of course it made sense. The Ruran cavalry were famous, and a mother who died afraid for her son and quietly arming him from beyond the grave was exactly the kind of true thing a man wants to believe. I understand now, he breathed. No wonder they're so, Your Highness, if the court learns you have Ruran soldiers. So we don't say Ruran, I said easily. We say I recruited them myself over the years, in secret. Assassins and mercenaries. The armor came from the treasures my mother left me. Understood? Understood. He nodded hard, already sold. My steward was, I want to be clear, the most loyal man alive and also not a spy master, and the story fit into the shape of my mother's memory so neatly he never questioned a seam of it, which was the point. Good. Assemble and move out. Keep them behind us for now, scattered in with the guards. We'll keep it quiet until Southern Anne. So we did. 1,000 5-star killers, broken into small clumps and salted through my little procession so that from a distance we still looked like one nervous prince and his handful of doomed retainers, which was very much the impression I wanted to give, especially to the men currently watching us from the hills. There were two of them, up in the hills, and they didn't know about each other, which was going to become very funny in about an hour. The first group was Xiaorui's. My dear third brother had kept his promise. A leader in black and a few hundred professional throat cutters, sent to make sure I never reached Southern Anne. The second group was a delightful surprise even to me, the Blood Fiend Camp, 300 hard men led by a scar-faced veteran named Wang Xiong, sent by Grand Commandant Liu personally. Because Li Tao's precious granddaughter had come home slapped and humiliated with her love letters in her fist, and the old fox couldn't let the family lose that much face without a body to balance the books. See? I told you the humiliation would pay dividends. I just didn't expect the first one this fast. Both groups had been told the same thing. 300 guards, 1 soft prince, easy kill. Both groups had spent a day counting my procession and getting increasingly confused because their scouts kept reporting 1,300 men, not 300, and something about the way this guard column marched that didn't sit right, too orderly, too quiet. Wang Xiong decided it didn't matter. Grand Commandant led this camp himself once, he told his men. 300 of us charged formations meant to break 10,000. Those people down there may look sharp, but they're green. A brand new unit, no teamwork yet. Split into 5, Blood Fiend formation, and when they hit the valley, we kill them all. He gripped his sword. The Grand Commandant's granddaughter was defiled by that bastard. We avenge it today. Which, I want to note for the record, I had not defiled anyone. I had exposed a cheater and slapped her once. But a man like Li Tao would rather tell his soldiers defiled than our girl got caught and embarrassed, so that's the story they marched in on. The lies people tell to save face have a way of getting other people killed. Xiaorui's leader, watching from the other hill, saw the Blood Fiend camp move and smiled like the heavens had opened. Perfect. Let them charge first. When they've got the prince's men tangled up, we cut off the retreat and take the credit. He never even wondered why a second small army was hiding in the same hills. He was too pleased. 800 killers, closing in on 1,300 men in a narrow valley. If those 1,300 had really been my 300 guards plus a rabble, it might even have been a fight. I lifted the curtain, glanced up at both hills, and let myself smile. Good timing. Because that morning, I'd done my second check-in, and this time I'd chosen general. Kill! The arrows came first, both sides at once, a black rain off both slopes, and the valley erupting with gray-cloaked blood fiend and black-clad assassins pouring down from every direction. Elder Kai screamed at the guards to form a wall around the carriage. I lifted the curtain the rest of the way and said, calm as ordering lunch. Elder Kai, there's no need to panic. Then louder, Tiger Brave Army, proceed as planned, and the guards stopped being guards. The 1,000 men scattered through my column snapped together in a single breath, and the loose, sleepy procession folded itself into a shape. 4 tight blocks, shields locked, a formation that looked less like soldiers and more like a machine that had been waiting patiently for someone to feed it. The arrows came down and hit the shields like rain on tin. Nothing, not one man fell. What is that formation? Elder Kai whispered. The Black Tortoise, I said, built to eat an ambush. On the hill, Wang Xiong's face changed. He was a real soldier. He knew what he was looking at, and he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. Not good. Pull back. Pull back. Too slow. The tortoise turned itself inside out, the 4 blocks unfolding like something alive, defense becoming attack between one heartbeat and the next, and rolled uphill into the Blood Fiend camp. Wang Xiong's proud formation, the one that had once broken armies, tore like wet paper, and then a single rider came out of my column at a dead gallop, iron spear leveled, and hit the ambush like a thrown stone hits a window. He was maybe 20, tall, straight-backed, eyes like he was already bored with how this was going to end. The spear in his hand moved like it had opinions. 3 assassins down before anyone reacted. A knife strike parried and answered so fast the man was flying before he understood he'd lost. Within 3 exchanges, 5 or 6 of them were on the ground, and the rest were backing away from him like he was on fire. Excellent marksmanship, Lin breathed, forgetting entirely that he was supposed to be terrified. This was General Number 2, my second pull, and the system, in its notes, had been almost apologetic about him, the way a banner is apologetic about a 4-star when you wanted the 5. Fierce General Hua Yanwu, 4 stars, famous general of the Southern Song, called the Little Overlord. Martial arts, 99, skilled at charging into battle, loyal, brave, a natural vanguard, 4 stars, 99 martial arts. In the field, a man who could ride through a formation like it was a curtain. I did not, at the time, feel shortchanged. It was over faster than it takes to burn a stick of incense. The Blood Fiend formation came apart, the assassins realized their perfect opportunity was a shared grave and tried to run, and the Tiger Brave Army closed the valley like a fist. When the dust settled, there were two men left standing who I actually wanted, Wang Xiong, bloody but still holding his chin up, and Xiao Rui's assassin leader, gray-faced and shaking so hard I could hear his teeth. Hua Yanwu swung down off his horse and dropped to one knee in front of me, spear across his back. Your humble subordinate, Hua Yanwu, greets his lord. Rise, general. I looked him over, young, sharp, that easy, dangerous stillness the best killers have. With you as my vanguard, I have a foothold in the southern wilderness already. You'll lead the Tiger Brave army until I say otherwise. To the death, my lord. Then they dragged the two captives in front of me, and I did the fun part. You, I said to the scarred one. Wang Xiong, Blood Fiend Camp, Grand Commandant Liu's old dog. His head jerked up. How do you? He sent you to avenge his granddaughter's honor. I leaned back. Except his granddaughter's honor is fine. She's just embarrassed. He underestimated me and he lied to you about why, and now you're going to die for a story that isn't even true. Cruel, isn't it? I turned to the trembling assassin. And you're my third brother's man. Sent to make sure the useless prince never reached his fief. His Highness Xiao Rui said you couldn't live to see Southern Anne, the coward blurted, tripping over himself to confess. Wang Xiong actually snarled at him. Spineless wretch, but a professional loyal to nobody will always sell out faster than a fanatic. My third brother is thorough, I said mildly. He wants his useless little brother dead before I've even arrived. I looked at Wang Xiong. You can die now. A flick of Hua Yanwu's spear and the Grand Commandant's old dog was done. Clean, quick, no theater. He'd earned that much for having the spine to lie about it to the end. Then I looked at the shaking assassin. You though, you get to go home, run back to my third brother, tell him exactly what you saw here, and tell him this. When I come back from Southern Anne, I'm going to collect on everything he spent today, with interest he can't afford. He kowtowed so hard he nearly knocked himself out, and then he ran. I watched him go, and I filed it, the way I filed everything now. Third brother, you shouldn't have moved on me this early. I've written it down. I found out much later how that news landed back in the capital, and it's worth the detour, because it's the first time I got to watch, secondhand, from a great and satisfying distance, the specific look on the faces of men who'd been certain I was already a corpse. Xiaorui got it first. When the lone survivor stumbled back and stammered out that his 500 assassins were dead in a ditch alongside 300 of Grand Commandant Liu's private killers, all of them gone, and the useless prince riding south without a scratch, my third brother did the thing frightened schemers always do. He didn't ask how, he asked who else knew. Then he made very sure the messenger wouldn't be telling the story around the palace, and sat alone in his study turning cold, because a plan that fails invisibly is a plan nobody can pin on you, and a plan that fails loudly is a debt with your name on it. Li Tao took it worse and louder. 300 of his men, gone, and his granddaughter's honor. The honor I'd supposedly stained, which was the whole pretext, still unavenged. So the second most powerful man in the empire swept into my father's presence and demanded action. Punish the Ruran bastard. Recall him. Make an example. He'd spent a career being able to make emperors move, and he fully expected to make this one move now. And my father, and this is the part I keep, because it's the truest thing anyone ever told me about my own family. My father listened to all of it and then declined, not out of mercy, out of arithmetic. Why should the throne dirty its hands, he said, and hand the boy a martyr's story when the southern wilderness is a grave that fills itself? The miasma, the warlords, the southern Li, let them do the quiet work. Give it a season. He was so certain of it that he wouldn't even spend a decree on me. My own father had done the math on my death and found it more economical to let the swamp handle it, and had gone back to his tea. He should have spent the decree. It was the cheapest I would ever be. Half a month of hard road later, we crossed into Yue province, and the empire finally ran out. No more prosperous towns, just rutted tracks, jungle pressing in on both sides, air that tasted like a wet coin, and every so often a whiff of something rotten drifting off the swamps, the famous miasma, come to say hello. This was the southern wilderness. Nannan Prefecture, on the map. 1 prefecture, 3 counties, a few 100,000 starving people, 5 warlords, and a foreign dynasty at the door. Officially my fief. Practically a hole my father had picked because things go into it and don't come out. My lord, Hua Yanwu said, riding up as the city finally showed on the horizon. The terrain here is a nightmare to attack and a gift to defend. Managed right, this could be a real base. That's the idea. I looked at those distant walls. First we plant a flag. The rest comes slow. The city was called Southern Anne, and the man who actually ran it was named Ma Kai. On paper he was commander of the Nannan garrison, 15,000 men. In practice he was a small king who'd spent 5 years buying off warlords, choking the tax rolls into his own pockets, and reporting to exactly one person, my eldest brother, the crown prince. Before I ever left the capital, Big Brother had written him a quiet little letter. If the useless one behaves, let him rot in a corner. If he doesn't, the miasma takes people all the time. Nobody would ask. Questions. So Makai greeted the arrival of his new prince the way you greet a fly at dinner. He didn't come to the gate. Instead, he sent a captain with a squad of cavalry and a sneer, and the sneer did most of the talking. There would be no royal mansion. The treasury is thin. Where would we find money to build a prince a house? There would only be the post house. And the post house, when we reached it, turned out to be a rotting shed with 20-some rooms, cobwebs in the rafters, bedding that smelled like the last man to die in it, and not nearly enough space for 300 guards, let alone 1,300. Squeeze in or put your people up at the inns, the captain said, enjoying himself. Oh, and General Yang says, if His Highness runs into any difficulties, he can always come and ask for help. Then he turned his horse and left without waiting to see my face. Elder Kai went the color of a plum. Your Highness, this is an insult. Let me go and find Ma Kai and… No, I said, and I actually laughed a little, low, watching the captain's back disappear. Let him kick the door and puff his chest and post his men to watch me sleep. Let him think I'm exactly the soft persimmon they all promised him. Because on the way in, I'd seen the real Southernan. Streets caved in, shops shuttered, fields outside the walls gone to weed. An old man selling fruit at the gate had been kicked to the ground by garrison soldiers for the crime of trying to sell fruit, and not one person in the crowd had dared to look up. These weren't soldiers holding a border, they were parasites who'd forgotten what the border was for. Hua Yanwu's hand had found his spear when he saw the old man go down. I'd shaken my head, not yet, and he'd let go, but I saw it cost him. Not yet, but soon. That evening, Ma Kai made his point one more time. He posted 1,000 of his men around the post house in 2 neat blocks east and west for the prince's protection. Elder Kai came to me white with fury. He's watching us. 1,000 of them, my lord. They're not guarding, they're, if he decides to. He won't decide anything tonight. I was sitting by the one window that still had shutters, watching the garrison soldiers slouch back and forth in the dark, bored, certain, comfortable. My eldest brother is a patient man, and a suspicious one. He told Ma Kai to wait and see, so Ma Kai will wait and see. He'll strut for a few days first, because men like him can't resist strutting, and then, when he's satisfied that I'm nothing, he'll get around to killing me. I stood up. Which gives us the few days. Go tell the brothers to bed down at the inns in the middle of the city, nice and scattered, nice and harmless. And then leave me alone tonight, Elder Kai. I have some arranging to do. He bowed and went, still worried, and I sat back down in the dark, closed my eyes, and dropped into the space in my head where the system lived. Because here was the thing Ma Kai didn't know, the thing my brother didn't know, the thing nobody in this rotting little city knew. For half a month on the road, I hadn't checked in every day. I'd been saving them up. Banking pulls. System. How many check-ins do I have? 15, plus 1 remaining newbie 3-star guarantee. 15,000 soldiers, or generals, or advisors, sitting in my head like coins in a fist. And a whole garrison of 15,000 strutting parasites sleeping out there in the city, completely certain that the boy in the rotting post house had 300 men and no friends in the world. I opened my eyes and looked out at Ma Kai's sentries, pacing the dark, guarding nothing, and I felt the smile come up my face all on its own. Let's spend them, I said quietly. All of them. First, the guarantee. I had 1 3-star or better token left, and I wasn't going to waste it on more muscle. In the southern wilderness, with 3 separate power blocks to untangle, soldiers weren't the problem. I needed a brain that wasn't mine. Use the newbie guarantee, advisor, summoning. Congratulations, host, 3-star advisor, Feng Jing, famous strategist of the late Eastern Han. Wisdom, 88, special skills, strategizing, plus 30% to any scheme success. Art of defense, plus 40% to city defenses. Foresight, plus 25% accuracy predicting enemy movements. White light gathered in the corner of that filthy room and set down a thin man in a green robe, middle-aged, with a scholar's stoop and eyes that took inventory of everything in the room, including me, in about 2 seconds. Feng Jing pays his respects to his lord. I helped him up, and I want to stop here for a second, because pulling Feng Jing out of that noon air changed my life more than any 5-star legion ever did, and I didn't know it yet, standing in a shed that smelled like a dead man's bedding. Here's the thing about growing up the way I grew up. When every person around you has decided you're worthless, you learn to do all your thinking alone, behind your own eyes, trusting no one, checking every plan against the certainty that the next hand reaching towards you means to take something. I'd been the smartest person in every room I'd been shoved into for 20 years, not because I'm a genius, but because I had to be, because there was no one else to be smart for me, and a stupid moment would have gotten me killed. It is a very effective way to survive and a very lonely way to live. And then a tired man in a green robe stood up in front of me, took the whole rotten chessboard in with 2 seconds and a scholar's stoop, and started telling me things about my own situation that were sharper than what I'd worked out myself. I felt something unknot in my chest that had been knotted since I was 6, not because he was brilliant, though he was, because for the first time in my life, the brilliance was pointed the same direction I was. I finally had a mind on my side of the table. I didn't have to hold the entire war in my own skull anymore. I could hand half of it to someone who would carry it as carefully as I did and go to sleep. He had the specific tired competence of a man who spent his whole life being smarter than the fools who employed him, and I made him a silent promise, right there, that I would be the first employer worth the trouble. I kept it. "Mr. Chen," I said, "tell me what you see in Southern Anne." He didn't even ask where he was. System-summoned people arrive knowing the situation, which is enormously convenient. He just held up 3 fingers. "3 powers, my lord. 1. Ma Kai, garrison commander, 15,000 men, your eldest brother's creature, 5 years dug in, the strongest. 2. The warlords in the hills, several thousand each, nominally loyal, actually kings of their own dirt. 3. The prefect, the court's civil official, who takes his orders from your 4th brother and will never lift a finger for you." He folded 2 fingers down, left the first. "The warlords are patient and the prefect is a coward. Ma Kai is the knot. Cut him and the rest is untangling string." "How?" "Fast." A little light came into the tired eyes. How many men can you produce, my lord?" "Truthfully," I told him. I watched a man who had served warlords and emperors sit very still and reconsider his entire understanding of the situation. "If that is true," he said slowly, "then we do not besiege Ma Kai. We do not negotiate with Ma Kai. We appear inside his city, all at once, in the dark, at every throat he has, and by dawn, there is no Ma Kai." He almost smiled. "The one thing an army can never hide is its assembly. 10,000 men cannot gather quietly, but if the 10,000 simply appear already in position, he never gets to be surprised in time to matter." I was already dropping back into the system. "Mr. Chen, give me an hour, then we'll draw a map." Then I opened the banner and I did what every degenerate does when they've been saving pulls. I dumped the whole thing. "Check in, army, 14 times. The results scrolled by, and look, this is the part of any big pull where the game reminds you it's still a game. The first 5 were Great Song Local Garrison, 1 star, farm boys with basic drills, combat power that would embarrass a scarecrow. The next 5, Great Ming Local Garrison, 1 star, marginally less embarrassing. I'll admit I frowned. 10,000 men, and every one of them a warm body with a spear he half knew how to hold. But Feng Jing, reading over my shoulder, figuratively, he couldn't see the panel, but he could see my face, said the exact thing I was landing on myself. "Don't sneer at numbers, my lord. Elites break the enemy. Bodies hold the ground. 10,000 ordinary men on the gates and the streets means Ma Kai's 15,000 can never gather, never reinforce, never contact each other. They become 15,000 small piles instead of one army. And then the last 4 pulls hit, and the game gave me my consolation prize with a flourish. 4,000 Northern Song Imperial Guard Infantry, 2 star. Fine steel sabers, heavy armor, one of the 3 imperial armies of their age, genuine elites, the kind that walk sideways through ordinary troops, 10,000 garrison to lock the city, 4,000 imperial guard to smash the camp, 1,000 Tiger Brave, the 5-star, held back as the hammer, and Hua Yanwu to swing it. Feng Jing and I bent over a map of Southern Anne by candlelight, and he taught me that night the difference between a soldier and a strategist, because my first instinct was to smash the garrison camp. 5,000 of Ma Kai's men, the hardcore, kill the head, and the body dies. Feng Jing shook his head. "Ma Kai is the head, my lord, yes. But 15,000 men in a city can rally, reinforce, run for the gates, and bring in the warlords. Kill the head, and you still have to fight the thrashing." He tapped the 4 gates, the crossroads, the main streets. "So first, you take the city's ability to become an army at all. 10,000 ordinary men on the gates and the junctions, not to win a battle, just to lock every door and cut every road, so that Ma Kai's 15,000 wake up as 15,000 separate men in 15,000 separate rooms with no way to find each other. Then the elites take the camp. Then you take his head, and there's no body left to thrash. It was the whole war in one map. And the city was small, 3 lie across, which meant the entire thing sat inside my 2-kilometer deployment range from the post house. I didn't have to march a single man through a single gate. I didn't have to smuggle or bribe or fight my way to a position. I just placed them. Think about that from Ma Kai's side, because it's the thing that broke him. There is no sound, no army on the road, no dust, no gate forced, no warning. The city goes to sleep with a soft prince and 300 guards rotting in a shed. And in the dead middle of the night, in the space of one breath, 15,000 soldiers are simply already there, at your gates, in your streets, around your camp, standing in the dark exactly where they mean to be, having never once existed on any road that a scout could watch. It's not a siege. It's not even an attack. It's waking up inside a trap that assembled itself out of the air while you dreamed. System. Deploy. And in the dark of the sleeping city, out of the noon empty air, my army arrived exactly where I put it. 1,000 men appeared at each of the 4 gates, and 1,000 more salted through the central streets, seizing every crossroads, until Makai's 15,000 were cut into pieces that couldn't find each other in the dark. 2,000 ambushers materialized in the lanes around the garrison camp in the north. 4,000 Imperial Guard formed up on 3 sides of that camp, close enough to spit on the sentries, and around the post house the 1,000 Tiger Brave came out of the night in full armor, silent, waiting. The 1,000 men Makai had posted to watch me were the first to learn how badly they'd misjudged the evening. Hua Yanwu walked out the post house gate in full harness, spear on his shoulder, and one of the sentries actually stepped up to stop him. "General Yang, where are you going this late?" "Where am I going?" Hua Yanwu said pleasantly, and lifted the spear. "To see you off." It was over around the post house in under a quarter hour. 1,000 of Makai's watchers, and not one of them got a warning out, because in every direction he might have run, there was already a wall of men who'd been standing there since before he woke up. Then the whole city went off at once. At the gates, the garrison sentries turned around to find 1,000 strangers already inside the wall behind them. At the crossroads, patrols walked into formations that hadn't been there an hour ago. And in the north, around Makai's own camp, the 4,000 Imperial Guard came in from 3 sides like a closing hand, while the ambushers in the streets caught anyone who tried to slip out the back. Makai's 5,000 camp troops were good, by Southern standards. They'd walked sideways through this town for years. That night, they discovered the difference between bullying merchants and meeting soldiers who'd been forged in real wars, and the discovery went badly. Their proud saber work broke against heavy armor and disciplined shields. Their formation folded, and when Hua Yanwu rode the Tiger Brave through the south gate of the camp like a nail through cloth, whatever was left of their nerve went with it. Makai himself, to his credit, got on a horse and rode out to meet the young general who'd cracked his world open. He was one of the best blades in the Nanan army. He lasted 3 exchanges. Hua Yanwu turned his first strike aside, took his saber off him on the second, and on the third, put him in the dirt with a broken arm and a spear at his throat. "Take him," Hua Yanwu said, "to see the prince." By the time the sky grayed, it was done. Feng Jing came to me with the count, and even he sounded a little stunned reading it. Of 15,000 garrison, roughly 1,000 dead or hurt, the rest on their knees with their hands over their heads. My side had lost about 30 men. They brought Makai to me in the post house hall, kneeling, gray, cradling his ruined arm, and I watched the whole city he'd owned for 5 years fall out from under him in his eyes. 15,000, he whispered. "Where?" My lord clearly brought 300 guards. "Where did they come from?" "General Yang." I leaned forward. "If I told you they appeared out of thin air, would you believe me?" He shook, because some animal part of him understood that the joke was also the truth. "You underestimated a useless prince," I said. "So did everyone who sent you. Every insult, every year, every man in this empire who decided what I was worth before I opened my mouth. You're the first installment on all of it." I sat back. "You have one question left, don't you?" "How?" "Yes," he breathed. "Please." "Then take it," I said, "and go ask King Yama himself." I nodded to Hua Yanwu. "Send the general on his way." He didn't get to keep his question, which was for the best. The answer would only have kept him up at night, and he wasn't going to have any more of those. By sunrise, Southern An had a new master, and it hadn't cost me a wall. Feng Jing was already down in the yamen, sitting in the prefect's own chair with the tax ledgers open, running the city like he'd run it his whole life, which, in a sense, he had. But the moment I remember from that morning isn't the count, it's Kai Quan. He came and found me on the wall as the sun came up over a city that had been Makai's the night before and was mine now, and he didn't say anything for a while, just stood there. This old man who'd carried my meals when I was 6 and everyone else pretended I was a ghost. Who'd wept quietly, half a year ago, certain he was following his young lord to a grave in the miasma. "Your Highness," he finally said, and his voice was doing something. "This old servant has watched you your whole life. The boy in the palace, the one they—" He stopped, started again. "How is this the same person?" I didn't have a clean answer, because in a way it wasn't the same person, and in a way it was exactly the same person, and always had been, just waiting for the door in the bottom of the hole. So I told him the only true thing I had. "It's the same person, Elder Kai. They just never once bothered to look." He nodded like that explained everything, and maybe for him it did. And then this old man, who'd had nothing but a doomed boy to be loyal to a year before, looked out over a whole city that would live or die on my word, and I watched him decide one final time that whatever I was becoming, he was coming with me all the way to the end of it. I have summoned 5-star legions out of the noon air. That morning on the wall, with that old man's hand on the stone beside mine, is still the richest I have ever felt. The city took the news the way cities do, badly at first, then all at once. The night's fighting had woken half of Southern Anne, and by the time the sun came up the streets were thick with rumor. Southern Lee has attacked. No, it's bandits. No, General Yang is dead. The garrison surrendered. The whole thing changed hands in the dark. Feng Jing put men on every corner with notices and a calm voice. The court is putting down rebels. This has nothing to do with Southern Lee. Go home. No one will be harmed. And slowly the panic drained out, because the one thing everyone could see was true. The new soldiers weren't kicking down doors or dragging off daughters. They were just standing there, polite, terrifyingly polite. By the second morning, the whole town had settled on the correct interpretation, and I heard it repeated in every tea house. Who said the 7th prince was useless? He was playing the pig to eat the tiger the whole time. I did enjoy that one. But the tiger wasn't finished. There was still a prefect. His name was Guo Liang. He answered to my 4th brother, and he'd spent 5 years turning Southern Anne into his personal purse. Feng Jing had spent one morning in the Yamen records and come out with a scroll. So I had the man brought to the hall, and I had Feng Jing read it to him. 5 years as prefect, colluding with Ma Kai, 100,000 taels skimmed off the taxes, private courts, dead innocents, relief grain that never reached a single starving mouth. Line after line, and Guo Liang going grayer with everyone. Then he grabbed at the only straw he had. Your Highness, you may hold a princely title, but you have no authority to execute an official of the imperial court. If you kill me, that is treason, a capital offense. I didn't get angry. I actually laughed. Treason. I came down the steps to him. Prefect Huang, since I arrived, this Southern Anne is mine. Here, I kill who I decide to kill. And the title, the fief, my father's little scraps of parchment. I let him see exactly how much I cared. Do you really think I'm holding on to those? That was the moment his eyes went wide, because he finally understood the shape of me. It wasn't that I didn't dare kill an imperial official, it was that I didn't care what killing one cost. His crimes were real, and every one of them had a face in the crowd outside. The merchant he'd ruined, the family he'd broken, the brother he'd thrown in a cell to die. So I read the charges out where the people could hear them, and I gave the corrupt Yamen its reckoning, and when it was done I had one thing hung above each of the 4 gates, a list of names and the crimes beside them, so that every soul in Southern Anne would know exactly which parasites had finally been pulled off their backs and why. I braced for a frightened city. I got a celebrating one. Because here's the thing, nobody in the capital ever understands about the common people. They don't care whose blood is in your veins. They care who's been eating them alive and who finally made it stop. Old men wept at the gates. Merchants came out of hiding. And when Feng Jing announced that every coin the corrupt officials had stolen would go straight back into relief for the poor, the cheering went up the walls. His Highness the 7th Prince stands up for us. An honest lord, at last. I stood on the wall listening to a whole city decide it loved me, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it wasn't nothing. I'd spent 10 years being nobody's, standing up there, being someone's, even a starving stranger's, landed somewhere I wasn't ready for it to land. I let it, just for a moment. Then I put it away, because there was work to do. And right on cue, the system decided I'd earned a promotion. Ding! The host has taken control of the southern wilderness and stabilized Southern Anne. New functions unlocked. System Mall. Spend points to exchange for weapons, tools, elixirs, techniques. More as your strength grows. Refugee Summon. Spend points to call refugees, who become farmers, artisans, merchants, soldiers. All summoned refugees are 100% loyal for life. Then it told me how to earn the points, and this is where I sat up again. 1,000 points for every city occupied, points for public sentiment, points for production, points for completing missions. And the first mission blinked up. Pacify the southern wilderness. Control the 3 counties of Nannan. Reward 5,000 points. Deadline 3 months. So the check-in was the appetizer, exactly like the cheerful little voice had promised. This was the main course. Soldiers were the sword. Points were how I built the arm to swing it. Grain, refugees, techniques, cities, a whole engine, and I'd just been handed the keys, which reminded me, Ma Kai had been running this city into the ground for 5 years. A man doesn't do that for free. I went to see his house. It was not a house. It was a palace wearing a general's uniform. Carved beams, painted rafters, a courtyard full of rare trees, a treasure vault in the back with an entire room of nothing but gold. Over 3 million taels of silver and gold when Hua Yanwu finished the count. 350,000 picals of grain, cloth, and silk by the cartload. All of it squeezed out of the poorest prefecture in the empire. This, I told Hua Yanwu walking through the vault, is a good place to work from. Clean it out and register everything. A share to the army, a share to the people. I looked around at the obscene wealth of a man who'd let his city rot. And I'll live here. Seems a shame to waste it. Yes, my lord. He hesitated. The family. Ma Kai's. We took his household. 2 sons, wife, some concubines, collateral relatives. Better than 20 people. Now, I'm not a gentleman, and I won't pretend to you that I am. In a world where the strong eat the weak, mercy can get you killed, and I'd already decided the Yang name wasn't going to grow back and stab me later. But there's a line, and I've watched too many great men in that capital step across it and call it strength, and I'm not them. The 2 sons, I said. Did they hold rank? The elder was a commander of 1,000, the younger a commander of 100. Then they're soldiers, and they knew what their father was. Those 2 answer for it. Grown men who'd worn the armor and taken the coin. The rest, the women, the children, the cousins who never held a blade, strip them of everything the family stole and send them out of the prefecture. Let them go be poor and forgotten somewhere far away. I'm not in the business of murdering babies to sleep easier. If that makes me soft, then I'm soft, and I'll still be sitting here when the last of them dies of old age. Hua Yanwu bowed. If he thought less of me for it, he kept it off his face. I suspect he thought more. I picked up a landscape painting off the wall, genuinely good, the one honest thing Ma Kai had ever owned, and decided it would look well in my new study. Then I opened the system panel and looked at my numbers, glowing quietly in the dark behind my eyes. 2,000 points, and climbing. 1 prefecture, 3 counties waiting, a mall, a refugee engine, 15,000 soldiers and 2 names, Hua Yanwu, Feng Jing, who'd follow me into a fire. The pig had eaten the tiger. Now the pig was going to build a kingdom. The prefecture had 3 counties hanging off it, Anyang, Yuxi, Linjiang, and technically, by the court's rules, a prince got as 1 city and no more. Technically, I sent Hua Yanwu out with 3,000 elites and a simple instruction. Be quick, be quiet, and take them all before the news outruns you. He took them in 3 days. The method was almost insultingly simple, and I loved it for that. His men put on captured garrison uniforms, rode up to each county gate at night waving Ma Kai's own command flag, and announced they were reinforcements. The gates opened. That was the whole trick. Turns out 5 years of Ma Kai's rot had trained every county in Nanyang to open the door for anyone with the right flag and the right sneer. By the time each little magistrate woke up, the war was over, and he was in a cell. The system noticed. Ding. Mission complete. Pacify the southern wilderness. Reward, 5,000 points. Occupation bonuses, 3,000 points. 8,000 points. Sitting in my head like money in a fresh account. And the mall was open, and the refugee summon was live. So let me tell you the actual problem with the southern wilderness, the one under all the other problems, the one Ma Kai and every governor before him had never been able to fix. It wasn't the miasma. It wasn't even the warlords. It was that nobody lived here. The whole prefecture, 3 counties, thousands of square li, held maybe 300,000 people, and they were leaving. An old farmer laid it out for me when I rode into the countryside to see for myself. 3 layers of misery, he called it. The land, mountains everywhere, floods in the rains, drought in the dry, a mew of ground yielding 100 caddies in a good year. The southern Lee raiders, across the river every autumn to steal the grain, and the strong men and the young women, gone before the county militia could even find its boots. And the warlords, local kings in the hills who taxed what the raiders left. Between the 3 of them, anyone with legs and sense had already walked north. His own village had gone from 200 households to under 50. You can't reclaim land, your highness, he told me, not unkindly, the way you explain water to a fish. Chop the trees, clear the weeds, dig the canals, 3-5 years before a harvest, and who's got the hands? A family's got 2 strong backs, they can't even work what they've got. No people, no work, no work. More poor, more leave. He sighed the deep sigh of a man who'd watched this arithmetic eat his whole world. It's a wheel, and it only turns one way. Now, if you're a normal ruler, this is where you despair, because he's right, and there's no honest fix that works in less than a generation. But I wasn't a normal ruler, I was a man with 8,000 points and a menu. Refugees summon, I said, alone in my new study that night. Ordinary refugees, 10 for 10 points. Excellent refugees, strong laborers, 10 for 50. Rare refugees, masters of a craft, 1 for 100. I ran the numbers the way you run them right before you spend money you'll regret. 5,000 points for 5,000 ordinary hands, 2,000 for 400 prime laborers, 1,000 for 10 rare masters. Confirm. Summoning. 3 days later, more than 5,000 people walked out of the horizon and asked to serve me. The morning they arrived, I rode out to the north gate to watch it with my own eyes, and it's a thing I'll carry to my grave. They came up the road in a river that didn't end. Old men leaning on sticks, women with babies on their hips, whole families pushing everything they owned in one squealing barrow. Thousands of them stretched back over the hills, travel-worn to the bone, and every face, when it lifted and found me on the wall, did the same thing, lit up like I was the answer to a prayer they'd been saying so long they'd forgotten the words. Because the system doesn't recruit refugees, it draws them out of the long river of Chinese history, the disaster survivors, the war-fled farmers, the exiled craftsmen, and sets them down here, loyal to me, bone deep, for life. An old man came forward and knelt and told me they'd heard Nanan was taking people so they'd come. When I asked him where he'd heard it, he opened his mouth and, nothing, scratched his head. It seems, and couldn't finish, because there was no where. There was only the pull the system had put in him, and he'd walked 1,000 li on it without ever wondering why. Elder Kai stood beside me, and I could see it eating at him. 5,000 people out of nowhere, choosing the poorest, most cursed corner of the empire, and not one of them able to say who told them. He was too loyal to ask, and too sharp not to notice. He tried once, gently, asked a man in the line where he was from, and got the same fog everyone gave. This, it seems, and then he looked up at me, and I watched him decide, one final time, not to ask. His young lord had done a great many impossible things lately, and the old man had quietly settled on a policy of loving me first and understanding me never. They weren't only hands either. Feng Jing went through the census and got the gleam I was learning to trust. 200 of them were literate, some even degree holders, and by nightfall he'd staffed my empty county offices with clerks who were competent, experienced, and the part he couldn't quite believe, loyal to me down to the marrow. Among the 400 prime laborers were the backs that could actually reclaim land. And among the 10 rare masters were 3 agronomists who understood terracing and irrigation, 4 builders, and 3 merchants who knew the trade routes, the kind of specialists you cannot buy for gold in a place like this because they don't exist here. It was the whole missing arm of the prefecture, delivered in one river of the loyal poor. But I want to tell you about a village, because it's the part that mattered to me more than the arithmetic. A few weeks in, I rode out to see the reclamation with my own eyes, and I stopped at a family working a strip of newly turned ground. The old farmer nearly fell over kneeling, and his daughter came across the field with lunch, bowls of the thing the poor eat down here, wild greens and coarse husk mashed into a ball, bitter as a grudge, hard as a fist, good for one thing only, which is not being hungry for another hour. Her father went red when he saw me looking at it, so I picked one up and ate it. I'll be honest, it was worse than it looked. Bitter enough to make your eyes water, rough enough that you feel it the whole way down. Feng Jing made a small strangled noise beside me. My lord, that is not for you. And it wasn't. It was never meant for anyone. But I chewed it and swallowed it and asked the old man about his harvests, and he told me the truth. That in a good year, most of it went to the taxmen and the warlords, and what he kept barely reached spring. I don't do a lot of speeches. I did a small one there. I told him no one was going to take it from him again. Not the taxmen, not the warlords, not the raiders across the river. That the ground he was turning was his, the harvest was his, and if anyone in Nanan ever tried to eat him alive again, they'd answer to me. He wept. His daughter wept. And I want to be careful with you here, because I've spent this whole story telling you how cold I can be, and it's all true. But the thing under the cold, the thing I don't show the smiling men in the capital, is that I know exactly what that bitter little ball tastes like, because a version of me was starving too, once, in a palace full of food, and nobody picked one up and ate it with me. That's why I built the kingdom, if you want the honest reason under all the strategy, not the throne, not the revenge, though I wanted those too. It was that I finally had the power to make sure that in at least one corner of the world, the smiling men didn't get to decide who ate. So we built. We started with an announcement. I sent Feng Jing up onto a platform in the main market with a scroll and a squad of clerks, and the whole city crammed in to hear it, half of them expecting new taxes. They did not get new taxes. They got the opposite. Effective immediately, he read. Every household 5 mu of farmland. 3 years, no tax. Anyone who reclaims wasteland keeps it and gets the 3 free years too. Water works on every river, dams for the floods, canals for the droughts, and the government hands out the tools and the food while you dig. Roads between every village, and wages, in real coin, for the labor. 30 coppers a day for the road gangs, 25 for the canals, paid on time, no deductions. You could hear the crowd not believe it. Then you could hear them start to. 30 coppers a day, somebody said, dazed. That's more than farming. A woman next to him just cried. An old man asked, To no one, whether it was a trick, because in the southern wilderness, the government had never handed a peasant a copper. The government took. And when the first road gang got paid at the end of the first day, in full, in coin, no cut for the foreman, no fee, the story of it went through the prefecture faster than any decree. The Lord pays, on time, every copper. That was the real weapon, not the soldiers, the 30 coppers. I put the 10,000-odd captured garrison to work too. The parasites who'd spent years kicking fruit sellers now dug the canals they'd never bothered to fix, better than feeding them in a cell. And I had a thing the poor South had never had, masters. The rare ones the system pulled. Agronomists who knew how to terrace a cursed hillside. Engineers who could read a river. Blacksmiths whose tools didn't snap in a season. They fanned out through the villages and taught, and the land started to answer. I rode out through it, that first season, and I want you to understand what I was looking at because I'd been told my whole life it was impossible. Terraces climbing hills that had grown nothing but weeds, canals full of moving water where there'd been dust, fruit tree saplings in neat rows on the slopes, lychee, longan, mango, things the north had never tasted, blacksmiths ringing in villages that had been half empty, a charity school with children in it, cooking smoke in the evenings off 100 hearths that had been cold a month before. A woman at a village gate had a little girl who pointed at the saplings and asked if they'd have fruit next year. Yes, the woman told her, and we can sell it and have money, and she said it like the word money still felt dangerous in her mouth. This barren place is going to be reborn, I'd told them in the square, and you are the ones who'll do it. I hadn't been making a speech, I'd been making a promise, and the thing about me, the one thing that separates me from the smiling men in the capital, is that I keep them, and I close the borders. Merchants and refugees could come in, nobody went out. To guard against Southern Lee spies, we said, which was true enough that no one argued, and which also meant that whatever grew here grew where the capital couldn't see it. Because that was the whole plan, not glory, not a single grand battle, an old, boring, unbeatable strategy that a much smarter man wrote down a very long time ago. Build high walls, store up grain, and delay declaring yourself king. The southern wilderness was barren, yes, but barren meant nobody was watching. Barren meant time. And time was the one thing my father had accidentally given me when he thought he was giving me a grave. That first autumn, the harvest came in, and I rode out to see it, and I want you to understand what it looked like because it's the whole reason under all the strategy. Golden fields, as far as I could see. Rice heavy enough to bow the stalks, on ground that a year before had grown nothing but weeds and fever. Men swinging sickles, women binding sheaves, children pushing little carts and getting in everyone's way and laughing. An old farmer stopped his work to bow, and then couldn't help himself, and said the thing I'll remember when I'm dying. This year, Your Highness, we get to keep it. For the first time in his long, hard life, no Southern Lee rider was going to cross the river and take the grain out of his barn. No warlord was going to ride down from the hills for his cut. No taxman was going to leave him with husks. He'd grown it, and it was his, and he said it like a man saying a prayer he'd stopped believing anyone was listening to. I sat my horse at the edge of that field and watched a whole people harvest in peace for the first time in living memory, and I thought about the smiling men in the capital who'd sent me here to die, and I felt something settle in me that was harder and colder and more patient than any hatred. I wasn't just building an army down here. I was building the thing I was going to make them answer for taking from everyone like that old farmer, for a generation, with a smile. Let it grow slow, I told the dark, standing on my terrace, watching the cooking smoke rise off villages that had been empty a month before. I have all the patience in the world. And somewhere north, in a warm palace, my father was surely thinking of me, if he thought of me at all, as a problem that had solved itself. Enjoy the quiet, father, you're going to miss it, which left the warlords. 4 of them, up in the hills, each with his own little kingdom. And when I sent Feng Jing to gather the details made the decision for me. 2 of the 4, Luo Jiantian at Shishan, Zhou Changshong at Nanshan, were just bandits with titles, but the other 2, Tuoba Gang and Huyan Li, were worse. They didn't only tax the villages, they fed them to the raiders. Every autumn when the Southern Lee rode across, those 2 guided them. This village has grain, that one has young women, and took 1/10 of the take for the service. They sold their own people into slavery across the river. The system flagged them for extermination, and for once, the system and I were in complete agreement. But hitting a mountain stronghold head-on is how you lose half an army on the cliffs. So before I did anything, I saved up 10 days of check-ins and pulled the intermediate banner, and the intermediate banner was generous. Thousands of family army cavalry, the elite horse of a northern Song general, guerrilla fighters born in the saddle, and their commander riding in with them, a sharp young officer named Guan Jian. I finally had cavalry. And with cavalry, an army worth a name, so I gave it one. Everything but my 1,000 Tiger Brave guards went under Hua Yanwu as a single force, and I called it the Divine Martial Army because a barren prince with a printing press for soldiers might as well have a little theater. For the first 2 warlords, I let Feng Jing be clever. Shishan sat on a cliff with one path up, guarded like a coin purse, so we didn't climb it. We knocked. A trusted officer named Sun Bao dressed a dozen carts. As a grain delivery, the kind Ma Kai used to send up every couple of months to keep the warlord sweet, and rolled right up to the gate. Old Zhang usually delivers, the guard said, suspicious. Old Zhang's sick, Sun Bao said, and by the way, General Yang sent extra this time and some very good wine, and a warlord who's been getting free grain and free wine for years does not, it turns out, look very hard at the delivery boy. The way Sun Bao told it to me afterward, it was almost too easy. The guards at the foot of the mountain squinted at the new faces. Where's Old Zhang? And Sun Bao just smiled and spun the story. Old Zhang's poorly. General Yang sent extra hands and extra wine this time. Come see. And the moment the guards smelled the wine, the suspicion went out of them like air from a bladder. They pried a jar open right there at the gate, breathed it in, and one of them actually laughed. Good stuff. They searched the carts, spears jabbed down into the rice sacks to check for men, hands patting down the farmers for weapons, and found nothing, because there was nothing to find yet. The men were the carts. The weapons came later. Luo Zhantian himself came down to look them over, a big rough slab of a man who fancied himself a hero, and Sun Bao laid the flattery on with a trowel. Chief, your name's a legend across the whole southern wilderness. General Yang wanted you to have the best. And Luo Zhantian, who had exactly the kind of vanity that eats flattery like candy, waved them up the mountain and told his kitchen to kill a pig. Stay the night, he boomed. Drink my wine, drink his wine. That was the whole plan, and he'd handed it to us himself, so they feasted. Sun Bao wandered the hall all evening with a bowl in his hand, laughing too loud, pouring for everyone he passed, playing the happy fool, and making very sure, in his cheerful stumbling way, that every single man in that stronghold got the doctored jars, while his own people quietly drank the clean stuff they'd set aside. He even sent a couple of jars down to the gate guards, because it'd be a shame to leave the brothers out. By the time the moon was up, Luo Zhantian was flushed and roaring toasts, and one by one, all around him, his men were going face down in their dinner. He noticed too late. He always would have. He was still trying to work out why the room was tilting when his second-in-command slid off his bench and hit the floor, and then another, and then Luo Zhantian looked up through the fog at the smiling grain boy who wasn't stumbling anymore at all. Sweet dreams, Sun Bao told him. It was the last thing the warlord of Xishan ever heard. They opened the gate, fired a signal arrow, and Guanjian came up the mountain in the dark to a stronghold that was already asleep. Most of the men woke in chains, bound for the work gangs, a better fate than the one they'd have handed anybody weaker. A cliff fortress meant to hold 10,000 taken by a dozen carts of wine, without my army losing a single man. I've never been prouder of a hangover. Nanshan, I let Hua Yanwu take the honest way because Zhou Kongxiang had built his stronghold soft and I wanted the other two watching. It took him half a day. He rode up the mountain at the front of the divine martial army, put his spear through the gate and everything behind it, and when Zhou Kongxiang dropped his sword and knelt begging, Hua Yanwu didn't even slow down. 2 warlords, 2 mornings, and then there were 2, the dangerous ones. I could have marched on them too. 9,000 men between them, dug into hills, and it would have cost me. So instead I wrote them a letter. It was a very polite letter. It noted sadly that Luo Zhantian and Zhou Kongxiang had been wicked men who left me no choice. It observed that Tuoba Gang and Huyan Li were, of course, different. Men of standing, officials of the court. Surely we could talk. It invited them to southern An to discuss the future of the region over a banquet of the highest standard. Feng Jing read it over my shoulder and started to smile. My lord, this is a trap. Of course it's a trap. They'll know it's a trap. They'll know it's a trap, I agreed, and they'll come anyway, because I've handed them a sliver of hope, that maybe they can keep a little of their power, cut a deal, walk out whole. A cornered man will fight to the death. A man who thinks there's a door will walk toward the door, even when he can see it's painted on the wall. I sealed the letter. That's the cruelest kind, the trap you understand perfectly and step into anyway because the alternative is worse. That's what despair actually is, Mr. Chen, not blindness. Choice, with all the choices removed. They came, just as I knew they would, and they were clever about it too, in the way that clever men are right up until it doesn't matter. They brought their whole armies, 9,000 strong, and arrayed them outside my walls, and they left orders, if we don't come out in 2 hours, attack the city. Then the 2 of them walked in with their 50 personal guards, thinking the army at their back was a knife at my throat. The banquet was genuinely excellent. I made sure of it. Since it was their last meal, they should eat well, and they tried to talk. Watching them try was the entertainment I'd bought with the whole spread. They opened with theater. Those 2 dead warlords, Tuoba Gang said, shaking his head over his wine, Luo Zhantian and Zhou Chengxiang, bandits, utterly. They had it coming. Your Highness did the region a service, distancing themselves from the corpses. Then Huyan Lai took his turn, and his angle was legitimacy. They weren't bandits, you understand. Their families had held these hills as the court's own appointed officials for generations. They'd served loyally. They were nothing like those two. One playing the tough, one playing the reasonable man. They'd even worked out the roles in advance. It was almost professional. I let them run. I ate. I said, "Is that so?" a couple of times just to keep them talking, because a man showing you all his cards is a man you should never interrupt. When the loyalty routine ran dry, they moved to the reminder. Tuoba Gang, delicately, "Your Highness, the office of warlord is granted by the imperial court. A prince taking up a fief. I'm not sure he has the standing to remove us. Surely that's a matter for an imperial decree," which was their polite way of asking what right a discarded bastard had to touch them. And when that got no rise out of me either, Hu Yanli finally reached for the knife they'd both been holding under the table the whole meal. "There are 9,000 men outside your walls, Your Highness. If anything were to happen to us in here, aren't you afraid?" And there it was. Every card, face up. So I told them what I knew, that Tuoba Gang had burned out a granary manager and his whole family, that Hu Yanli had worked 300 men to death on his walls, that for all Hu Yanli's talk of loyal service, they'd both spent years guiding the southern Lai raiders to their own people's villages and taking a cut of the slaves. I watched the color go out of them, one crime at a time, because they'd walked in thinking their sins were secret, and I was reading them off like a grocery list. The warlord system, I said, was a stopgap the court set up generations ago and then forgot to end. You two turned it into a private kingdom and a slave market and called it holding a region. There is nothing here worth keeping. Their hands drifted to their sword hilts. I saw it. I let them see me see it. Then I put down my chopsticks. "I invited you here for one reason," I said. "To let you have a good last meal. And then to send you on your way." I stood. "You've eaten and drunk your fill. So, gentlemen, please, go and die." Hu Yanli came out of his chair with his blade half drawn, roaring for his men outside to attack the city, and Wu Cheng walked in with the Tiger Brave guards and had his 50 personal guards on the floor before the shout finished leaving his mouth. Hua Yanwu kicked the table between me and them and pointed his spear, and I sighed at the ruined banquet because it really had been a very good spread. "You had it prepared," Tuoba Gang whispered, going gray. "The whole time." "Of course. Why do you think I set the banquet?" They died there, the two of them, quick, at Hua Yanwu's spear, and Tuoba Gang, at the end, spent his last breath begging me to see the 9,000 outside. If we don't come out, they attack. I let him keep the hope one more minute. I even had him carried to the wall to watch, because I wanted him to see it. Out beyond the gate, where his 9,000 stood in loose ranks waiting for leaders who were never walking back out, thousands of family cavalry came out of a dry gully at a dead run. And here's the thing about the Z family horse that those 9,000 learned in about the span of a breath. They don't fight the way cavalry is supposed to fight. They were guerrilla riders, born in the saddle, and they didn't crash into a formation and grind. They came apart into knots and streams, hit the mass from 4 sides at once, peeled off before anyone could set a spear, and came back through the gap they'd just opened. 9,000 leaderless men found themselves being unstitched by 1,000 horsemen who were never quite where the spears were pointing. It wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration. Guanjian split them off from the gate, cut the road they'd have run for, and folded the two halves in on each other, and a leaderless army with no line to hold and nowhere to run stopped being an army and became a crowd, and a crowd being ridden through by veteran cavalry is just arithmetic with screaming. It was over in the time it takes to eat a meal. The whole while, I stood on the wall next to a dying warlord and said nothing because the scything below was saying it for me. This army, Tuoba Gang breathed, watching everything he'd built die in the field below, isn't the garrison. This isn't Ma Kai's rabble. What are you? Only realizing now? I said. Too late. I looked down at the last warlord in the southern wilderness. Go tell Ma Kai when you see him. Nanan doesn't need warlords anymore. The system chimed while the field was still being cleared. Ding. Mission complete. Exterminate the warlords. Reward. 30,000 points. Skills obtained. Mountain reclamation. Fruit tree cultivation. 6 fruit varieties suited to the southern climate. 30,000 points. And the exact techniques I needed to turn those cursed hills into something that fed people. The whole prefecture was mine now, top to bottom. No warlords, no garrison, no parasites. Just me. An army that appeared out of the air. A strategist. And 100,000 people who'd started, cautiously, to believe their lives might get better. And here's the part the histories always skip. The part I think actually matters more than any battle, because any warlord can win a field, but almost none of them can feed one. While the swords were doing their loud work, the system was quietly doing the thing that would make all of it permanent. It didn't just print soldiers, it printed the country under them. Every day I could spend points, and I spent them like a man who'd been starving his whole life and had finally been handed a full granary. Farmers, not soldiers, farmers, tens of thousands of them, summoned out of the long river of history with the knowledge of 100 generations of working dirt already in their hands. Master craftsmen. Well diggers and bridge builders, and men who knew how to cut an irrigation channel so the water ran uphill when it had to. And the seed, high-yield rice the like of which this age had never seen, 3 crops a year off ground that used to grudge you 800 caddies to the mew where the local farmers wept with joy over 320,000 oxen handed out to families who'd been breaking their own backs in the traces because they couldn't afford an animal. You want to know what conquers a province for good? Not a spear, an ox, a sack of seed that yields triple, a tax year with the word none written next to it, a road you can cart your surplus down to a market that actually pays. I gave the South all of it at once, and the South did the rest itself, because people who are fed and safe and allowed to keep what they grow will build you a civilization out of pure relief, just to prove the good times are real. Within a season, the maps were lying. Ground marked wasteland, miasmic, uninhabitable, was terraced green to the ridgelines. Villages that had been a name and a graveyard had smoke coming off them, and children in the lanes. The population didn't climb, it detonated. Past 300,000, past 4, reaching for 500,000. Every new soul either summoned loyal or drawn in from some neighboring misery by the rumor that there was one corner of the empire where a poor man got to keep his own harvest. My point balance climbed right along with it because the system paid me for every acre reclaimed and every mouth fed, which meant the richer my people got, the richer I got, the more I could pour back in. It was the one perfect machine in a broken world, and my father had handed me the key to it because he thought he was handing me a coffin. Let it run, I told Feng Jing. Every quiet season down here is a loud one coming for them up there. And 200 li to the south, across a fast brown river, the Southern Lai dynasty was getting ready to do what it did every autumn, ride over and take whatever it wanted from the weak little southern wilderness. They hadn't heard yet. They were about to. Now, while the southern wilderness was quietly filling up with loyal farmers and my point balance was quietly filling up with the interest on all of it, I kept pulling the banner. And the banner had started to notice I was serious. I drew Bai Songshan, 4 stars. A Southern song general who was also, in his own life, one of the greatest poets the language ever produced. A man who could calm a province with a brush and take one with a sword. Where Hua Yanwu was a hammer, Bai Songshan was a chessboard. I gave him a second army, the heavy infantry, and named it the Divine Might Army. 2 hands now, one that breaks, one that thinks. I drew Shu Rong, 4 stars. And when the white light set him down in my hall, I actually took a step back, because the histories undersell him. 9 feet of muscle, a face like a thundercloud, and a pair of iron halberds that together weighed more than a grown man, carried like a farmer carries a pair of hoes. This was the fiend of the 3 kingdoms who once, in a real and desperate hour, planted himself in a gateway and held it alone against 100 men so his lord could get over a wall to safety, and kept holding it after the spears went through him, dying on his feet in the doorway because falling down would have opened the road. That is not a soldier, that is a wall that happens to breathe. He knelt, and the floor complained about it, and he asked in a voice like rocks in a barrel who it was he'd be dying for this time. I told him nobody was dying for me if I could help it. He seemed mildly disappointed. I stood him at my own back as commander of my personal guard, because a prince with my growing collection of enemies should sleep behind the meanest door in the world, and Shu Rong was a door that killed. From that day, he was rarely more than 10 feet from me, a silent mountain in the corner of every room, and I slept better than I had in 20 years of palaces, because for the first time, the thing standing between me and a knife in the dark was on my side and could not be bought, bribed, or frightened, having already, in another life, done the whole business of dying and found it didn't take. And the moment I had 3 names of 3 stars or better under me, the system made a sound it had never made. Ding. System evolving. Primary form to intermediate. Everything got better at once. 3,000 soldiers a pull instead of 1. The check-in odds climbed, city construction unlocked. And now, when I pulled the high banner, a 4-star or a 5-star wasn't a lucky dream, it was a real chance. My little printing press had become a foundry. And here's where I have to close a door, because I can hear the obvious question since I asked it myself the first week. If I could summon armies out of the air, why not simply bank a year of pulls, print 100,000 men in a single afternoon, and march straight up the road to burn down the capital and put my father's smile on a spike? Believe me, I ran that fantasy more than once, usually late at night. The system, it turned out, had thought of it first. 1 check-in a day, not 2, not 10, 1, no matter how badly I wanted more, so the army could only ever grow at the speed of the sunrise. And the good stuff, the masters, the grain, the high tools, the rare tier legions from the shop, none of that came free. It came from points, and points came from exactly one place: governing well, reclaim an acre, earn, feed a family, earn, pacify a county, hold a city, keep a border, earn. The cheat didn't pay me for wanting a kingdom, it paid me for building one. which meant the fastest way to power ran straight through the boring, patient, unglamorous work of actually making a wasteland thrive, and the man who tried to skip that and rush the throne on borrowed soldiers would arrive with a paper army and an empty treasury and get himself killed in a season. So the exploit closed itself and left me with the one strategy that was always going to win anyway: grow the country and let the country buy the war. My father had handed a discarded son a machine that only rewarded the one thing his whole court had forgotten how to do: govern. I intended to outgovern an empire. The pulls kept coming, and each one landed like a gift my father would have wept to deny me. A whole legion of Eastern Jin heavy infantry, the men who once shattered a superior army at Fei River, arriving already in ranks. Bingzhou Wolf Riders, 3,000 light horse out of the borderlands, the kind of cavalry that legend says rode as Lu Bu's own guard. I watched 5 of their centurions gallop the drill ground at a dead run and put arrows through targets 100 paces out without slowing, bodies steady as stone in the saddle. Even Bai Songshan, who did not impress easily, breathed out and admitted the Southern Li's finest horse wouldn't measure up. They came down the field in their wolf pack charge, gathering, scattering, folding back on themselves, and I thought, yes, send me more. And one batch of pulls I remember by heart because of the middle one. 3 armies in 3 days. On the first day, the noon air gave me 1,000 Northern Wei iron cavalry, Xianbei horse lords in gleaming plate, the kind of heavy horse that doesn't maneuver so much as delete whatever's in front of it, under a burly, plain-spoken commander named Guo Wu. On the third day, it gave me the Han family army, 1,000 Southern Song infantry so disciplined they made my other elites look twitchy, bows and crossbows and long spears, and a genius, their commander Gao Shun told me, for letting an enemy exhaust himself and then walking in over the corpse of his own momentum. But the second day is the one I think about. The second day, the system gave me the Great Qin convict army, and when they formed up on the drill ground, I actually walked down the line to look at them because they were the strangest soldiers I ever owned. Not glittering, no fine armor, no proud banners. 1,000 hard-weathered men in plain kit, every one of them, historically, a condemned criminal, death row, the noose already measured, who'd been offered the one bargain the ancient Qin was famous for: fight, win, live, earn your life back with the enemies. There is a specific look in the eye of a man who has already been told the exact date of his death and then handed a sword and a maybe, and 1,000 of them looking at you at once is a thing you feel in your spine. Their commander, a scarred veteran named Wang Da, put it plainest when I asked what his men were good for. Anything you don't expect other men to walk back from, Your Highness. He didn't smile. We don't count on walking back. That's the whole advantage. I gave them the jobs nobody else should have to take, and they took them like men collecting a debt the world owed them. Cavalry, a death squad, and a wall of patient spears. 3 more shapes of the same message I was building toward, one pull at a time, because every pull was one more nail in the coffin of the man they'd all decided I was. I formed the elite corps into a second army under Bai Songshan, the Divine Might Army, heavy infantry with a poet at the head of it, and between him and Hua Yanwu, I now had 2 hands, one that broke things and one that outthought them. I was going to need both, because the Southern Li were coming. They came the way they always came: Wang Hai, commander of the Sui army across the river, riding out with 7,000 men for the annual tax collection, 3,000 cavalry, 500 war elephants. And a swagger built on years of the southern wilderness being too weak to do anything but bleed. They joked about it on the march. Last year I took 30 peakles, this year 60. I heard the girls down there are pretty. They'd been doing it so long it had stopped being war and become a harvest festival with extra murder. They did not know that the harvest had grown teeth. They reached the Linkang River, the fast brown border, at their usual crossing, where they'd built a secret pontoon bridge over the years and used it like their own front door. And they found, on the far bank, something new, a border fort that hadn't been there in the spring, with Guanjian standing on the watchtower watching them build their bridge. He let them get the cavalry halfway across. Then 300 fire arrows turned the pontoon bridge into a river of flame, and the front half of Wang Hai's proud horse went into the current with their mounts. It was the first time in living memory that anyone on the North Bank had done anything to the Southern Li but flinch, and I would have paid money to see Wang Hai's face. He was too stubborn to quit. He gathered fishing boats, the local fishermen were all in his pocket, and started forcing a crossing anyway, a few hundred at a time. And that was exactly what Hua Yanwu wanted, because Feng Jing had read this the way he read everything 3 moves out. Don't stop them crossing, he'd said, fanning himself with that feather fan he'd taken to carrying. Help them. Let every last one get across and get comfortable. A river at your enemy's back is worth more than any wall, but only once they've turned it into a back. So Guanjian's men on the fort loosed a few token volleys, deliberately short, sparse enough to look like a garrison that couldn't shoot straight, and the Southern Li waded ashore laughing at us. Their scouts crept up on the fort and reported it half empty and sleepy. Wang Hai, who'd already lost his bridge and his temper, took the bait whole, pushed everyone across on the fishing boats, formed them up on the north bank, and marched inland on the undefended fort to burn it down, feeling clever, feeling owed. Hua Yanwu let the fort's defenders meet that advance and then break, a real-looking rout, men falling back in a hurry, drawing the whole southern Li column away from the river and deep into open ground between two tree lines. And when Wang Hai's army was strung out and committed, chasing a beaten enemy toward what they thought was a burning victory, 5,000 of the divine martial army came out of the trees on both flanks at once and folded them against their own crossing. The men who'd waded a cold river to harvest my land found the harvest was them, with the water they'd just crossed now sealing off the only way home. That would have been enough. What made it a story was the elephants. Wang Hai still had 500 war elephants, and war elephants, it turns out, are genuinely terrifying. 3 armored tons apiece, tusks like spears, trunks like whips, and when they charged, they tore a hole in the divine martial army's line like a fist through paper. Hua Yanwu lost men under their feet, and I won't pretend he didn't. Arrows just bounced off the iron plates. For a few minutes, Wang Hai was actually winning, laughing on his horse, watching my elites scatter before his behemoths. "These are my southern Li elephants," he told his deputy. "Look how they run." They ran all right. They ran exactly where Hua Yanwu pointed them, because Hua Yanwu wasn't scattering. He was retreating in a very specific direction, toward a low, wet, innocent-looking stretch of muddy ground, and the elephants, drunk on the charge, thundered right in after him, 3 armored tons apiece, on mud. You already see it, don't you? The elephants saw it about 4 seconds too late. The first one sank to the knee, then the belly, and the weight of their own armor pulled them down, and the elephants behind, too big, too fast, too committed to stop, piled in on top of them. 500 unstoppable killing machines turned into 500 trapped, screaming targets in the space of a minute, and my archers, who had been very patiently waiting for this, went to work on the one soft spot every elephant has, which is its eyes. After that, it stopped being Wang Hai's harvest and started being his bill. Cavalry cut off from their own crossing, infantry with the river at their backs, elephants foundering in the mud, the 7,000 came apart, and Wang Hai himself was pulled off his horse and dragged to me in the dirt. "How does the southern wilderness suit your taste?" I asked him. He begged. Of course he begged. They always beg, the men who never spared a thought for mercy when they were the ones burning villages. I asked him if he'd shown mercy to the grain he stole, the men he took, the women he sold. He didn't have an answer, so I didn't have a use for him, and his head went up over my gate as a very clear letter to the dynasty across the river. The southern wilderness is not your harvest anymore. Ding. Mission complete. Repel Southern Li. Evaluation, excellent. Reward, 40,000 points, city defense blueprints, siege weapon blueprints. Bonus for exceptional completion, 10,000 points. And then, because the system loves to escalate right when you've caught your breath, it posted 2 new missions. Retake Nanjin Pass, the great fortress the Southern Li had stolen years ago and used as their bridgehead, and a second one, which made me smile because it meant the system and I had reached the same conclusion at the same time. Blood for blood. Cross the river. Take 2 of their cities. Let the Southern Li learn what it feels like to be the ones getting harvested. I'd been on the defensive since the day I was born. My whole life, other people decided what I was worth and came to collect it. Standing over Wang Hai's captured elephants, watching my elites pull the survivors out of the mud, I felt the shape of the thing turn over for the first time. I was done being harvested. It was somebody else's turn. The capital noticed the silence before it noticed anything else. A month with no memorials from Nanan, no military reports from Manga, no taxes, no letters, no news, just a hole in the map where a prefecture used to send its dutiful little updates. My father, up on his throne, went from puzzled to suspicious to a specific cold worry that his least favorite son might be doing something worse than dying. So he sent a man to find out, an imperial censor named Dong Kong with 300 guards and an official decree riding south to see what the useless prince was up to. I knew he was coming before he reached the border because by now Feng Jing had built me something the southern wilderness had never had, an intelligence service. I'd pulled a special unit off the banner, 6,000 men trained for exactly this, and scattered them north as merchants and travelers under a commander named Guo Shu. Nothing moved between the capital and my border that I didn't hear about within days. My father thought he was sending a spy into the dark. He was sending one into a room full of my eyes. I should tell you about those eyes because they won me more battles than any spear, and nobody ever puts them on a thumbnail. When the banner handed me a unit called the Embroidered Uniform Guard, I nearly passed it over. 6,000 men who weren't really soldiers, not the kind you line up on a wall. They were the other thing. Watchers, listeners, men and women who could be a wine merchant in one town and a beggar in the next and a temple clerk in the third, who could read a face across a room, follow a courier for 300 li without once being seen, and put a knife somewhere quiet if a knife was what the night called for. Guo Shu ran them, a soft-spoken man you'd forget the instant he left a room, which was exactly the point of him. And Feng Jing understood immediately what I had. Information, he told me, is the only weapon that wins the fight before it starts. So while I was still a joke in a wasteland, we were already seeding the whole north, tea houses, post stations, the servants' quarters of the mansions that mattered, and, in time, one very well-placed clerk inside my father's own Ministry of War. It cost me points I could have spent on another legion, and it was the best trade I ever made, because from that season on, I did not fight blind. Not once. Every army that marched south, I knew its size and its road and its general's temper before it cleared its own gate. Every secret edict I read a copy of before the man it was addressed to. My enemies kept thinking they were springing surprises on me, and every surprise had already been sitting on my desk for a week, getting cold. That's the real cheat, if you want to know. Not the soldiers out of thin air. The eyes. Dong Kong's journey did most of my work for me, and my people sent back reports of it that I treasure to this day. He rode south expecting a miasma-choked ruin and a beaten-down boy, and for a while he got what he expected: bad roads, refugee camps, the usual southern misery. He complained about all of it: the heat, the mosquitoes, the potholes, the fact that a great censor of the empire had been sent to inspect a place where not even the birds relieved themselves. And then he crossed into Nan'an proper, and the complaining stopped because the road under his wheels turned into stone paving smoother than the imperial highway, lined with young trees, dotted with clean, tidy rest stops where merchants sat drinking tea and talking about how good business had gotten in the wasteland. He leaned out of his carriage and stared at farmland that had been swamp on the maps and was now green terraces climbing the hills in orderly rows. He passed tea houses full of people praising a prince who cut their taxes and hanged their tyrants. He heard, in a market, a soldier of mine buy a bun and insist on paying for it, and watched an old woman press hot food into a patrol's hands and the patrol thank her and take nothing. If you know anything about the empire, you know how impossible that last part is. A good man doesn't become a soldier. That's 1,000 years of proverb. The common folk flee from military men. And here was a city where the grandmothers fed the garrison out of love. My spies said the color drained out of Dong Kong's face somewhere around there, because a man doesn't build that in a month unless he's building something the throne should be very afraid of. And then, at the last great fort before the city, the empire's own censor learned exactly how much his decree was worth in my land. His guard captain barked that they carried an imperial envoy and demanded passage, and the officer of the gate looked at the imperial seal, looked at Dong Kong, and said, politely, immovably, that no one entered Nan'an without a Nan'an travel permit, which had not existed a month ago, and which only my people could issue, and that an imperial envoy of all people should set an example by respecting the rules. When the captain blustered, 100 of my soldiers materialized out of the fort with the specific bored competence of men who'd done far worse than this, and Dong Kong sat in his carriage and submitted to a full inspection of his person and his baggage by soldiers who did not care in the slightest that he outranked their whole province on paper. By the time he reached my hall, the poor man had already half figured it out and hated every inch of it. He tried to sneer anyway. Old habit. He wanted to know where the soldiers came from and who'd forged the armor, and whether His Highness perhaps imagined my father had sent me here to play at being a king. And then he got to the part every one of them always gets to, the part they think is the winning card, and he lowered his voice and reached for my mother. Given your highness's origins, he said, savoring it, the filth that flows in your veins, is it wise to be raising an army on the border? People might remember the Ruran rebellion. I let him finish. I found it's better to let them finish. It tells you exactly where the knife is. Lord Chen, I said, what a performance. I didn't raise my voice. You came here to frighten a boy you've spent years despising, and you've realized halfway through your own speech that the boy has a city, an army, and no particular respect for your decree. I stood. Let me save us both some time. You're not going home to tell my father anything. You're going to sit in a comfortable room in southern Anne, and you're going to write him a letter, and the letter is going to say that his loyal 7th son is behaving beautifully, that the reason for the silence was a southern Li raid, that the old prefect died in it, and that I myself was badly wounded and am still recovering, and then you're going to stay my guest until I decide otherwise. He puffed himself up one last time. I am an imperial envoy. You cannot. The old reflex of a man who'd spent 40 years being feared for a title. So I decided to educate the title out of him. I had him walk to the drill ground. 3,000 of the divine martial army stood waiting on it, black armor drinking the light, blades grounded, not a man moving. On a single word they went from stone to storm, the whole formation shifting and reforming, blades flashing up in unison, a mock charge that shook the earth and stopped dead a foot from where I'd told them to stop. All 3,000 freezing at once like one creature that had merely decided not to kill today. The kind of discipline you cannot fake and cannot buy, the kind the Imperial Guard in the capital would weep to own. Dong Kang's legs went out from under him. He actually sat down in the dirt, because he finally understood, in his body where sneering couldn't reach, what he'd walked into. Not a sulking exile, not a mongrel prince with 300 guards. A man who could raise this in a wasteland in a season, and who therefore did not, in any way that mattered, care about an imperial decree or the man who'd signed it. I crouched down next to him in the dust, while his elite army held its silent line. "You came here to frighten me with a piece of paper, Lord Chen," I said. "I hope the tour was educational." He wrote the letter. Men usually do, once the guards close the door and the sneer has nowhere left to go. But Dong Kong had spent 40 years in the censorate, and 40 years teaches a man to hide daggers inside flattery. An overloaded word here, a wrong note there. Little seems that an ordinary reader slides past, but that the old foxes at court would catch and read backward. He handed it over with a small, satisfied light in his eyes, certain he'd out-clevered the barbarian prince. He'd forgotten I grew up in that court too. I read words for a living before I ever read maps. I found every seam in one pass, and I walked back into his room, and I set the letter on the table in front of him, and I didn't touch him. "The word unfortunate," I said quietly, used just heavily enough. Striving for good governance, the sarcasm in the phrasing, and a mark at the very end, the kind a man leaves for a reader who knows to look. I met his eyes. "I'm not going to hurt your hands, Lord Chen. I don't need to. I just need you to understand that I read you completely, on the first pass, and that the men you were writing to are not cleverer than me. They're only older, so you're going to write it again. Cleanly. And you're going to understand that if I find one more seam, your value to me ends, and a man with no value is a very cheap thing in the southern wilderness." He wrote it again, cleanly. His hand shook, but the words were honest, because I'd taken away the one thing he'd been counting on, the belief that he was smarter than the person holding him. The letter rode north under his own seal, and it bought me exactly what I needed. Hesitation. But not for long, and I want to be fair to my father here, because he was not a fool, whatever else he was. My spies watched the court read that letter, and the letter did its job on the surface. The 7th prince gravely wounded, the silence explained, a southern Li raid to blame, nothing to fear. Half the ministers exhaled, but the old foxes, the ones who'd survived 40 years of court by reading what wasn't written, frowned over it. It was too careful. Dong Kong had been a plain, blunt man his whole career, and here was a letter that chose every word like it was walking on ice. A blunt man doesn't suddenly turn cautious unless a hand is on his throat. And my father, sitting alone with it under a lamp, found the thing I'd missed that he wouldn't, a tiny mark at the letter's end. A private signal, agreed between him and Dong Kong years before, for exactly one meaning: I am not free. He read that dot, and he understood in an instant that his envoy was a prisoner, and the reassurance was a leash, and instead of raging, he went very quiet and very cold, the way the truly dangerous do, because he'd already hedged. That was the part I learned too late. He hadn't waited on the letter at all. He'd put 50,000 troops under a trusted general on my border before Dong Kong ever rode south, a knife held behind his back the whole time we were exchanging polite lies. And now, certain his son was up to something, he told that general to stop waiting and go find out. A hesitating enemy is a gift. But my father had only been hesitating with one hand. The other had already drawn. As for Dong Kong, his value ended sooner than either of us planned, because my people up north brought back the thing his letter had been quietly built to hide. My father hadn't waited on the letter at all. He'd already put 50,000 troops in the field under one of his generals, poised at the border, and Dong Kong had known it the whole time and stalled me while it moved into place. He'd been braver and more dangerous than I gave a sneering old man credit for, so he went the way traitors and spies go in a war, quickly and without ceremony, and I didn't make a show of it, because he'd tried to bury an army in a kind letter, and very nearly managed it. That earns a clean end. It doesn't earn a slow one. I leave the slow ones to my father's court. That was always their specialty, not mine. But before any of that came due, I had 2 Southern Li missions to close, and I closed them the way you close a door on someone's fingers. Nanjian Pass first, the great fortress at the river's narrowest throat that the Southern Li had stolen years ago and turned into their private gate into my land. Bai Songshan took it in a single night, and the taking was almost embarrassing. Wang Hai had marched off with every good soldier for his little tax-collecting festival, so the pass that had once held 100,000 at bay was garrisoned by 700 old men and drunks under a commander who spent his evenings toasting his own good luck. That night he was toasting it again. I hear his last clear thought was wondering why General Zhao was taking so long this year, while the poet general and his best climbers were already going up the eastern cliff hand over hand in the dark, and a loud feint kept the sleepy gate looking the wrong way. By the time the alarm went up, the Divine Might army held the high ground and the towers, and the defenders' great advantage of height became the thing that pinned them in place to be taken. An hour, 300 of the defenders down, the rest kneeling, And when the first light came up, the banner of Baeksuan flew over Nanjian Pass for the first time in 8 years. Except it was mine now, not the court's. The Southern Li had spent nearly a decade riding through their own stolen front door, and they hadn't yet noticed I'd changed the locks. And then, blood for blood. I want to be clear about what this raid was, because it wasn't glory and it wasn't conquest. For years, the Southern Li had crossed my river to take grain, take the strong young men, take the daughters. So I sent Hua Yanwu and Bai Songshan across theirs, through the pass, into Suye Prefecture, into 2 fat cities that had grown rich off my people's stolen harvests, and I told them exactly what to take. Not the land. I didn't want to hold their cities. I couldn't yet. I wanted their people. Grain by the 100,000 pekels, yes, and the cloth and the iron and the fine wine, all of it plundered back with interest, but mostly the artisans and the strong hands and the farmers, the exact thing the Southern Li had spent a generation stealing from me, carried north across the river to build my kingdom instead of theirs. The cities never had a chance. Hua Yanwu brought a toy from the system mall, cloud-climbing ladders, 3-story siege towers on iron wheels, hide-armored so the arrows and the boiling oil just thudded off, and the men walked up inside them and stepped straight onto the wall dry and whole. The defenders, who'd spent their lives on the safe side of these raids, watched their impregnable walls turn into a doorway and simply stopped believing in the world. One city's commander surrendered on the spot. The other lasted an hour. Then my generals did the thing the Southern Li had done to my people every autumn for a generation and did it better. They opened the granaries and loaded the grain that had been stolen from my south back onto carts. They gathered the blacksmiths, the weavers, the potters, the strong young men, and marched them north. Not in chains, mostly. Bai Songshan stood on a cart and told them the truth. The southern wilderness is empty, and it is fed, and it is safe, and any of you willing to live in peace will have land and a wage and a life, which is more than the men who ruled you here ever offered. A surprising number believed him. The ones who'd lived under the Southern Li's own taxmen usually did. Feng Jing put it best, reading the hall. They took one of ours for years. We return it tenfold. Now let them feel what it is to wake up and find the young men gone. 2 cities emptied in a night. 60-odd thousand people, mostly the strong and the skilled, walking north to a barren land that suddenly wasn't so barren. And the Southern Lai dynasty, waking to smoke and silence in Suye, finally understood that the arrangement had changed, that the river ran both ways now, and the second direction had teeth. They were, as you can imagine, furious. They were about to make a very large mistake about exactly how furious to be. The Southern Li emperor took the loss of 2 cities the way proud men take everything, personally. For a generation, his dynasty had used my river like a private larder, riding over each autumn to take grain and hands and daughters, and not once in all those years had it occurred to any of them that the larder might one day cut back. Now 2 of his fat border cities stood emptied, their granaries hauled north, their artisans and strong young men walking off to build somebody else's kingdom, and the man responsible was a discarded princeling the Baeksuan court itself had thrown in a hole to die. That was the part that put his court in an uproar, not just the loss, the insult of the loss. Beaten, robbed, and made ridiculous by a corpse that hadn't had the decency to lie down. His ministers wanted blood, and they wanted a lot of it, and the emperor gave them the man to spill it. Wu Yun. 80,000 troops, the largest force the Southern Li had put in the field in a generation, handed to the best young general the dynasty had, 28 years old. A family of generals stretching back generations, governor of a whole province's armies before most men make captain. And this was the part everyone kept repeating, like a charm they were rubbing for luck, never once defeated. I heard later how Wu Yun took the commission, and it told me everything about how the young man's mind worked. He didn't rage, he studied. He read every scrap his spies could bring him about the Wasteland Prince and his phantom armies, and he came away certain of a comfortable thing, that I'd gotten lucky against a lazy garrison commander, that my elites were a rumor inflated by frightened peasants, and that a real army under a real general would roll over my little fortress like a cart over a frog. He was going to march up to my river, break my toy fortress, and hand his emperor my head as an apology gift, and he'd already half composed the victory memorial in his head. He was, in fairness, exactly the general the Southern Li should have sent. He was also about to learn my river the hard way, one drowned formation at a time. 80,000 men, marching north to erase the exiled prince and his little wasteland. 30,000 heavy infantry, 20,000 light cavalry, 10,000 heavy horse, 20,000 archers. On paper, it was a wall of iron aimed straight at my throat. On the ground, it had to fit through Nanjian Pass, and Nanjian Pass was mine now. Feng Jing had spent weeks making that choke into a nightmare. The pass sat at the river's narrowest point, cliffs on both banks, and the only way across was one great stone bridge. Wide, yes, but only wide enough for 8 horsemen abreast. 80,000 men means nothing on a bridge that fits 8. Wu Yun could stack his whole army against that river and still only ever hand me a few hundred at a time, walking into massed crossbows and ballistas from a wall I'd reinforced with rammed earth and poured iron until it laughed at boulders. He tried the honest way first because he was young and proud and had never lost. Day 1. The shield wall. 10,000 heavy infantry locked into an iron tortoise, giant steel shields overhead and front, grinding across the bridge to soak up our arrows and reach the wall. A good move. Feng Jing smiled at it. Those shields are strong, General Yang, but they're heavy, and he'd never bring bows to bear against them anyway. Then he gave the word, and the ballistas spoke. Dozens of them, each throwing bolts the length of a man with the power of 10 crossbows, and the unbreakable tortoise came apart, shields shattered, front ranks knocked flat, and on. A bridge that narrow, there's nowhere for the men behind to go. Half of them went off the sides into the current. The tortoise crawled home a third smaller. Day 2. The arrow storm. 20,000 of the Empire's best archers, meant to sweep our wall clean. But we had the high ground and prepared cover, great shields racked along the battlements, and their arrows rained down and stuck in wood while ours came down the slope into them. They were spending a fortune in arrows to scratch a wall. They gave that up too. Day 3, the heavy cavalry. 10,000 armored horse, men and mounts both in iron, the pride of the Wang family, walked onto the stone bridge to smash the gate, and the ballistas and the trebuchets turned the front of that charge into a wreck of iron and screaming horses before it ever reached the wood. A bridge that fits 8 is a terrible place to die on a horse. They learned it the expensive way. Day after day, Wu Yun threw his beautiful army at my river, and my river handed it back to him in pieces. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a coward. He was simply feeding a masterwork of a fortress with an army that had no way to bring its size to bear, and somewhere around the 4th day, I watched, from the wall, the exact moment the never-defeated boy understood he was losing. So he got frustrated. He sent his champions to challenge us to single combat, hoping to break our nerve by killing our general in front of the men. Hua Yanwu rode out to meet each one, and I almost felt bad for them. The first came out roaring, some famous southern Li spearman, and announced to the whole field that he'd never heard of any Hua Yanwu and would be teaching the unknown nobody how to hold a spear. Then he thrust. A good thrust, honestly, a killing line at the face with a hidden second move folded into it, the kind of thing that had ended a lot of men. Hua Yanwu didn't dodge it. He coiled his own spear around the man's shaft like a snake taking a branch and pulled, and the man's hands went numb and his weapon nearly jumped out of them. First round, you lose. The spearman backed off, rattled, then came in furious. 7, 8 thrusts in a blur, everything he had. Hua Yanwu swayed his spear and turned every one of them aside like a man waving off flies. Second round, you lose, and on the third pass he simply put his spear through the argument and ended it. 3 rounds, exactly as promised. The second one was bigger and meaner, a burly brute with a tiger-headed gilt spear who came in like a landslide. He lasted 1 exchange. Hua Yanwu tipped the landslide aside with a flick of the shaft, twisted, and had him off his horse and finished before the dust of his charge had settled. By now, Wu Yun had stopped sending his men to win and started sending them to survive. And when a fierce general leaves his wall to fight, the whole army watches him do it. So he changed tactics. He sent 2 at once, not 2 fools. His cavalry commander and his vanguard general, a saber and a spear, 2 seasoned veterans who'd fought side by side so long they moved like one man with 4 arms, coming in from both flanks at once. It was, on paper, the answer. Hua Yanwu let them close, let their perfect coordination commit, and then feinted a killing thrust at the saber, and the instant both of them shifted to cover it, together, the way their years of teamwork demanded, he twisted off the feint and drove through the spearman on the other side, who was, for one fatal half-second, looking the wrong way at a threat that was never real. The saber turned to run. Turning to run from Hua Yanwu is just dying tired. 2 veterans, 1 exchange, and the thing that killed them was the very coordination that was supposed to save them. And then Hua Yanwu sat his horse alone in the middle of the field, in front of 80,000 men, wiped his spear, and asked, pleasantly, like a host offering more tea, whether anyone else would care to come and die, or whether the great Governor Wang might like to try it himself. Nobody came. Wu Yun had watched 4 of his best generals die at one man's spear, and I could see, even from the wall, the exact moment the never-defeated boy realized he was going to lose here if he kept doing this. So he got clever, which was exactly what Feng Jing was counting on. If you can't force the bridge, you find another crossing. Wu Yun's scouts searched the river for days and finally found a shallow ford 10 li upstream, chest-deep gentle banks, and, most temptingly, barely guarded, sparse patrols, careless ones, a soft spot. He planned a night crossing, 5,000 of his best, over the ford in the dark, around behind Nanjian Pass to cut our supply line, and then the whole fortress would wither. It was a good plan. It was also a door painted on a wall, and we'd painted it. The soft spot was soft because Feng Jing made it soft. The careless patrols were careless on purpose. Every step of the ford that looked undefended was undefended the way a baited pit is empty. Hua Yanwu lay in the grass on the cliffs above that ford from afternoon into night. 3,000 men hidden in the rocks around him, and watched Wu Yun's elites wade the cold river in the dark, group by group, congratulating themselves on their cleverness. He let them all get across. He let them get comfortable on the north bank, forming up to march. He let the trap fill completely. Then he lit the night up. 300 fire arrows off the cliffs at once, and the whole dark ford went from silence to daylight. The slope suddenly a wall of torches, 3,000 voices coming down out of the rocks, and 5,000 of Wu Yun's best caught in the open with wet armor, cold hands, a river at their backs, and formations that had come apart the moment they waded ashore. They tried to rally. You could hear the officers screaming for ranks. But there's no ranks to be had when you're packed in a river bottom and death is falling on you from above, and Guanjian's cavalry had already come around the flank and nailed the door to the ford shut behind them, and into the middle of it went Hua Yanwu. I've told you what he is on a battlefield. That night, by torchlight, in a killing pen he'd helped build, he was something out of an old and frightening story. He picked the banner, Wu Yun's own standard, the heart of the trapped command, and he went at it in a straight line, and nothing in between survived the trip. 3 guards down at the first pass. He wheeled and came back through, and the hole was wider. Wheeled again. Wider. 7 times he drove into that guard, and 7 times he came out the far side with the standard a little closer, and by the 5th pass, the pride of the Southern Li, the untouchable elites of a whole dynasty, were backing away from a single rider the way you back away from a burning house because some part of the animal brain had decided that man was not a man, but a weather event. Wu Yun, to his everlasting credit, did not run. 28 years old, never beaten, 4 of his champions already dead at this fiend's spear, and he drew his own saber and rode out to meet him. Because if he was going to lose, he was going to lose with his sword out, and I respect that even now. He was good. He was better than the 4 champions, better than Ma Kai, better than anyone Hua Yanwu had crossed spears with in the southern wilderness. He got a strike off, a hard one, a killing arc at the head, and Hua Yanwu turned it aside with the shaft without seeming to hurry. Wu Yun spun, cut low, and the spear was already there, cut high, and the spear was already there. Every line he opened was closed before he committed to it, and I know that feeling only from the outside, but I understand it from the inside. It is the specific horror of realizing, mid-fight, that the other man is simply operating at a speed you don't have. It ended the way it had to. Hua Yanwu broke the saber's line, and the iron spear went through, and the young general who'd never lost slid off his horse into the mud of a foreign ford. Then Hua Yanwu took his head, rode to high ground, and lifted it into the torchlight so 80,000 men across the river could see it. That was the whole battle, really, not the killing, the head. Because the moment the Southern Li army saw that their untouchable young commander, the boy who never lost, was a trophy on a spear, whatever held them together came undone. The 5,000 at the ford were finished on the spot. And the rest, the great host across the river, was now a leaderless mob standing in front of a fortress it couldn't take, and a leaderless mob is just a crowd waiting to become a rout. The rest tried to run. A deputy named Chao Ping took command of the leaderless host and started pulling it back towards Suya, and for a moment he might have saved most of them. He didn't get the moment. Bai Songshan arrived with the Divine Might army before the retreat could form up, and I'd already sent word, don't let them go home to try again, so they didn't. Hua Yanwu's hammer from one side, Bai Songshan's from the other, and the great host that had come to erase me got driven back against the same Linkong River their commander had died crossing. Cao Ping made a real stand of it, backs to the water, and it was brave, and it didn't matter, because a leaderless mob against 2 coordinated elite armies with a river behind it isn't a battle. It's arithmetic. It ended the way these things end when one side has planned it and the other has only marched into it. Tens of thousands surrendered, good strong hands for the work gangs in the fields. The generals who'd led the invasion were finished, and their heads went south across the river to the Southern Li Emperor, with a short clear message attached. This is the price of the southern wilderness now. 80,000 men. The largest army the Southern Li had put in the field in a generation. Gone. At a fortress they thought was defended by a joke, commanded by a general they'd never heard of, ordered by a prince the whole world had thrown away. The system chimed its rewards. My point balance climbed past anything I could spend in a season. My border went quiet, properly quiet, the quiet of an enemy who has just learned to be afraid, and I stood on the wall of Nanjian Pass, looking at a river that had run one way my whole life and now ran mine, and I thought about the letter Dong Kang had sent my father, the one that said I was gravely wounded and quietly recovering in my little wasteland. That letter had a shelf life. You cannot annihilate 80,000 foreign troops and keep it a secret. The news was already walking north on 10,000 tongues, and when it reached the capital, my father was going to open his eyes and see, for the first time, what his least favorite son had built while he wasn't looking. I found I was looking forward to it. My father, it turned out, hadn't waited for the news at all. He'd been suspicious since Dong Kong's letter smelled wrong to him, and he'd already put an army on my doorstep. 50,000 men under General Chen Gao, one of his most trusted commanders, sitting just across the border in Jiangnan, and Chen Gao, being careful, didn't march them in. He peeled off 5,000 of his best cavalry, dressed them as merchant caravans, and sent them south to see the southern wilderness with their own eyes before he committed. 5,000 elite horsemen, pretending to be traders, slipping quietly into my land. I knew about them before they crossed the border. Guoshu's people had been walking beside them the whole way, close enough to count their horses. I knew how they'd split up, which roads they'd taken, where they slept. Chen Gao thought he was sending scouts into the dark. He was sending them into a room where I'd already read the seating chart. Bai Songshan let them all the way in. He let the merchants spread out through the inns of a border town, let them stable their 2 fine horses and post their 2 disciplined watches and settle in feeling clever and unseen. And the whole time, the drunks slumped in the doorways and the waiters refilling their cups and the night watchman knocking his gong were my people, counting them, mapping them, waiting. At midnight, the town went from silent to daylight. 100 torches at once, every inn ringed, every escape route already stopped, and Bai Songshan riding through the middle of it calling for their surrender before most of them had their boots on. A few of the disguised troopers went for their blades, professionals, brave enough, but there's no fight to be had when the ambush was in the walls before you arrived. 5,000 of the Empire's finest cavalry, folded up in one night without a real battle, because you cannot parry a knife you never saw drawn, and Chen Gao himself, who'd ridden along with them, unable to resist seeing my wasteland with his own careful eyes, woke to find his tent full of my men and his whole clever probe already a prisoner of the exact enemy he'd come to measure. He didn't rage. That was the first thing I liked about him. He just looked at the disciplined soldiers holding him, and I imagine he did the same grim arithmetic Qin Zhan would do later and reached the same cold total. They brought him to me in chains, and I have to say, I respected him more than anyone the capital had sent yet. He didn't beg. He didn't bluster about my mother's blood. He looked at the prosperous, orderly, terrifying thing I'd built out of a death-fief, and he understood exactly what it meant, and he stood there with his hands bound and told me flatly that I was a traitor and that whatever power I'd raised, the Empire had 1,000,000 soldiers and I would end in pieces. Maybe, I said, but not today. General Li, I need your military tally and a letter in your own hand to move those 50,000 men. You'll get neither. He didn't even blink. I've been loyal my whole life. Kill me if you like. That army does not move on anyone's word but mine, and mine you will never have. And here is where I did a thing I'm not going to dress up for you. Because I'd done my homework, the way I always do. I knew about the boy. A Bao, 10 years old, the son of a man named Zhao Feng, Chen Gao's brother-in-arms from their first posting, who'd held a pass with 300 men to cover the army's retreat and died doing it, handing his 3-year-old to his best friend with his last breath. Chen Gao had raised that boy as his own for 7 years. Best tutors, taught him the spear himself, the one soft place in a hard old soldier. I had Guo Xiu bring the boy in. Godfather, a Bao cried the second he saw the chains, and Chen Gao's face, the face that hadn't moved for the death threats, came apart like a wall giving way. I want to be honest about this, because the whole point of this story is that I'm not one of the smiling men in that capital, and if I lie to you about the ugly parts, then I'm exactly one of them. This was a cruel thing to do. I knew it was cruel while I was doing it. I looked at an old man's love for a dead friend's son, and I put my thumb on it and pressed, because pressing it would hand me 50,000 troops in the south, and I wanted them more than I wanted to feel clean. Chen Gao called me shameless. He was right. A prince, he spat, using a child. Yes, I said. Tell me, General, the men who founded dynasties, the ones the histories call great, which of them climbed up without stepping on bones? You've served the winners your whole life. You know what they are under the poetry. I didn't smile. This wasn't a place for the jokes. I'm not going to pretend this is honorable. It isn't. But honor is a leash the strong hand out to keep everyone else in line, and I have worn that leash for 20 years, and I am done wearing it. So write the letter. He looked at A Bao and then at me, and he made the trade every parent makes. He'd write it, on one condition. The boy went free, safe, back to Shu province, whatever happened to him. After you've written it and handed me the tally, I said, I give you my word as a prince. The boy walks out of here safe. I keep my word. That's the one thing I have that my father doesn't, and I did keep it. Whatever else you decide about me by the end of this, hold on to that. The child left safe, exactly as I promised. I'm capable of a great many cold things. Breaking a promise to a grieving man about an orphan is not one of them. The letter went north under Chen Gao's own seal and tally, and it said what I needed it to say: a southern Li resurgence, an urgent recall of the 50,000 to reinforce and to guard against southern Li spies, orders to avoid the main road and take the mountain path. The mountain path ran through a valley, narrow, cliffs on both sides. The kind of terrain a careful commander would never enter without scouting, and that 50,000 men obeying a direct order from their own general's tally walked straight into, because military orders are mountains and you do not question your commander's seal. Feng Jing had put the Divine Might Army's archers on both rims and the Divine Martial Army at both ends. I won't linger on it because it wasn't a battle. A battle is a thing with two sides. This was a box closing. 50,000 of the Empire soldiers, packed in a stone throat with no room to form up and no way out, and when it was over, more than half had surrendered and the rest would never leave that valley. The acting commander they'd sent in Chen Gao's place laid down his sword when he understood there was nothing left to command. And then I did the thing I'd promised, because a promise is the one currency I refuse to clip. I had a bow brought to the yard the next morning, the 10-year-old Chen Gao's adopted son, the boy whose face had done what 50,000 troops and a death threat couldn't. A horse, provisions, an escort of my own men under orders to see him all the way to Shu province and hand him to his kin whole. I crouched down to his level, the way you do with a child who's had a bad few days, and I told him he was going home. He didn't thank me. Smart boy. He looked at me the way children look at the adult who's just done something to the family they don't understand yet, and he asked in a small, hard voice whether his godfather was going to die. I could have lied. It would have been kinder for the length of one morning, and crueler for the length of his whole life, and I've been on the receiving end of that particular kindness, so I didn't do it to him. No, I told him. Your godfather kept his word, and I keep mine. He's my prisoner, not my enemy, and prisoners of mine who don't lie to me grow old. Go home. Grow up. Learn the spear he taught you. And when you're a man, come find me and tell me whether I was a monster or just someone who wanted to live badly enough to do an ugly thing once. I'll give you an honest answer. He rode out that afternoon under my banner, safe, exactly as I'd sworn, and I stood at the gate longer than I needed to, watching the dust of him go north. Elder Kai came and stood next to me and didn't say anything, which is the old man's way of saying a great deal. I know what I did to earn that letter. I put my thumb on a grieving man's one soft place and pressed. I don't get to feel clean about it. But the boy went home whole, and Chen Gao stayed alive in a good room, and somewhere in the ledger of the cold things I've done there is that one line written in ink that isn't quite black. It's not absolution. I'm not looking for any. It's just the truth, and I told you I'd tell you the truth. And the system, which has a genius for timing, chose that morning to hand me the best thing it had ever printed. Ding, advanced check-in, 5-star army, the Wei Wu Corps, 5,000 men, 5 stars, and not just any 5-star, the Wei Wu Corps, Wu Qi's own from the Warring States, the most feared heavy infantry the age ever produced. You didn't join them, you survived a test to be allowed to. 3 layers of armor, a long halberd, 50 crossbow bolts, 3 days rations on your back, and then march 100 li in half a day, and if you couldn't, you weren't one of them. 72 great battles in the histories, 64 outright wins. Once, 5,000 of them broke 500,000, and 5,000 of them were standing in my courtyard. They didn't move. That was the thing about them. 1,000 men will fidget. 5,000 of these stood in dead silence in their triple armor, halberds grounded, faces like carved stone, and the silence had a weight to it, like a mountain had walked into the yard and was politely waiting to be told where to fall. Feng Jing came out to look and actually stopped in the doorway. He'd served warlords and emperors, and he had never seen anything like it, and he said so, quietly, the way you'd talk in a temple. I stood in front of that wall of men, and I felt the last thing shift into place. 50,000 of my father's soldiers were dead, or mine in a valley. His trusted general was my prisoner. His envoy had sent him a lie. And I had a 5-star legion, 2 more, a poet and a fiend to lead them, and a whole southern province wide open in front of me. And under all of that hardware, there was the thing I kept not quite letting myself look at straight because it undid me a little every time I did. Every one of those people was loyal. Not bought loyal, not afraid loyal, not loyal until a better offer came along. Loyal to the marrow, the way the system had made them, and the way I'd since earned twice over. Hua Yanwu would ride into a stone wall if I pointed at it. Feng Jing sat up with my problems, like they were his own children. 100,000 people in the field said my name like it was a blessing they were afraid to wear out. And I want you to understand what that does to a man who grew up in the richest family in the empire and was the poorest person in it, because not one of those people had been his. My father signed my death warrant with a smile. My brothers sent killers down the road after my carriage. The girl I was promised to spat on my blood in front of a hall. I had a whole gilded family, and every single one of them would have stepped over my corpse without breaking stride. And then a wasteland nobody wanted handed me the thing the palace never had. People who were mine, who'd chosen me, who could not be bought or frightened off. Some of what came next, if I'm being honest with you, wasn't revenge at all. It was that I finally had something to lose, and I had spent my whole life watching that court take things from people weaker than it, and I had decided, down in a place I don't show anyone, that it was never going to take one single thing of mine again. There was no going back after the valley. The moment I turned Chen Gao's tally against his own men, I stopped being an exiled prince with a suspicious hobby and became, in the eyes of the throne, a rebel. Fine. Good even. I'd spent 20 years being what they decided I was. For once, I'd decided it myself. Mr. Chen, I said, we don't stop at the border anymore. He unrolled the map of the empire. Where do we start, my lord? I put my finger on the whole southern half of it. Everywhere. We sat up half that night arguing the shape of it, and it's worth showing you the argument, because it's the closest I ever came to losing my nerve. Feng Jing laid the pieces out flat. On my side of the board, the Divine Martial Army, the Divine Might Army, the Wei Wu Corps, the Tiger Brave Guards, near 40,000 system elites, every one of them were 3 ordinary men, plus 200,000 or 300,000 loyal refugees I could arm and train. On the other side, the whole of Baekchuan, a dynasty in decline, yes, corrupt, overtaxed, its border armies soft, but still a dynasty, with 1 million men somewhere on its rolls and the weight of a throne behind it. 40,000 against 1 million, I said, just to hear it out loud. 40,000 elites against 1 million on paper, Feng Jing corrected, spread across 17 provinces, half of them chasing bandits, most of them months away, and all of them belonging to a court that can't feed a wasteland or hold a border. He tapped the south. We don't fight the million, my lord. We take the south, fast, before the capital even finishes being surprised, and we make it a fortress they'd bleed a generation to crack. Then we let the rot do our work. A dynasty this sick doesn't need to be conquered, it needs to be outlived. And it was sick. My spies made sure I knew how sick. Last year a drought burned Jiangnan black. No harvest. Whole counties starving. This year floods drowned Hebei and threw a river of refugees onto every road north. The treasury was a dry well. The border armies hadn't been paid on time in years. And the court did what my court always did, squabbled over rank, skimmed the relief silver, plotted brother against brother while the empire rotted under them. Not one man with real power lost a single night's sleep over a starving village. And on top of all of it, a foreign dynasty had my father by the throat. Southern Li wanted a mountain of silver for the favor of not marching, and the empty treasury was going to have to find it somewhere. So no, my father could not simply raise a hand and crush me. He was a man holding a dozen leaking buckets, and I was one of them. Every soldier he sent south was a soldier not watching a border, not guarding a granary, not standing between his throne and the next son who wanted it. That was the whole gift of the rot. I didn't have to beat the empire. I only had to be more solid than it was, and wait, while it came apart on its own. And the reason for the world, I said, because the moment I turned Chen Gao's tally against his own men, I'm not a wronged prince anymore. I'm a rebel. Then don't be a rebel. He smiled the tired smile. Be the loyal son cleaning the corruption his father's too blind to see. There's a name that runs the whole south already, my lord, and every soul down there hates it. Li Tao. I sat with it, because this was the true edge of the cliff, and I knew it. Take this step, and there was no version of the story where I ever went home a forgiven prince. There was only winning, or my head on my father's gate beside the others. I thought about a woman dying in a cold palace. I thought about a bitter little ball of husk in an old farmer's hand. I thought about 20 years of the word bastard. Then I thought, they decided what I was worth before I could speak. For once in my life, I get to decide it myself. We take the south, I said, and we hang it all on Li Tao. But a rebel needs a reason, not for himself. I had plenty of my own, for everyone else. Raise your banner and shout, I want the throne, and every honest man in the empire lines up against you. Raise it and shout the right words, and half of them quietly hope you win. Feng Jing found me the right words, and the beautiful thing was that they were also true. The provinces south of me, Yue and Ku, were governed top to bottom by the disciples and creatures of one man, Grand Commandant Li Tao. The same Grand Commandant who'd hounded my mother into her grave and then wrapped me and his family to smother the scandal. For years his students had run these provinces as private mines, stolen land, extorted merchants, false charges, relief grain that never fed a soul, and every stolen coin flowed up the ladder to Li Tao in the capital. So I didn't march south as a rebel prince. I marched south under a banner that read, in effect, acting on heaven's behalf to clear the throne of a traitor, not against my father, against the corrupt minister poisoning him, and in every city I took, I proved it in the one language that can't be argued with. I opened the granaries, returned the stolen land, cut the vicious taxes, and dragged the local tyrant into the square. Bai Songshan was the man I trusted to hold the cities after Hua Yanwu broke them, and he was made for it in a way that still moves me a little. The poet general, he'd take a city at dusk, and by dawn there'd be notices on every corner in his own clean hand. Grain carts rolling into the poor districts, a grievance office open in the yamen with him sitting in it personally, untangling the knots of years. He drank the tea of a poor old woman who pressed it on him and thanked her like she was gentry. When the wealthy merchants came to buy their safety with chests of gold, he sent them away with their gold and told them to go do honest business in peace. And when the local young men lined up begging to join the army that had freed them, he turned them down gently. Go home, farm, rebuild. That's how you serve your city, because he understood the thing none of my enemies ever did. That a city is taken with a spear, but held with a full granary and an open hand, and the second one lasts longer. He wrote in a letter to me that I kept, that the people were calling me a righteous lord sent from heaven, and that after years of being ground down, they finally had someone standing up for them. He believed it. That was the strange good thing about Bai Songshan. He was one of the deadliest men I owned, and he genuinely believed we were the light. Some nights I let myself believe it too. That last part was the engine, and Feng Jing built it perfectly. In the first province city we took, Jianyang, Hua Yanwu went up the wall like the wrath of some minor god, and the garrison folded around him. But the second the fighting stopped, the army stopped too. No looting, no swaggering. Grain carried back to the people it was stolen from, and the corrupt prefect, a Li Tao man named Wang Mingde, we didn't kill in the fighting. We arrested him. Because a dead tyrant is a rumor. A tyrant on trial, in the square, with the whole city watching, is a weapon. I ran that trial myself, in the square, on a high platform, with the whole city packed in front of it, and the prefect kneeling in a prisoner's rags where a week ago he'd sat in silk. He tried to be brave at first, which I'll admit surprised me. As an official appointed by the court, he sneered, what crime could I possibly have committed? So I had Feng Jing read the ledgers, the 100,000 picules of relief grain the man had eaten during a famine while the city starved, the 3,000 mu of family land he declared wasteland and signed over to his own clan, the tax checkpoints, the false charges, the men he'd broken for the crime of being unable to pay. And then, the piece that took the sneer off his face, his own letters to Li Tao, listing how many gentry he'd bought for the Grand Commandant and how much silver he'd sent north that season. Every charge with a document behind it, every document read out loud, and the prefect going grayer with each one until the bravery ran out of him like water out of a cracked jar. Then I opened the floor, and that's when it stopped being a trial and became a reckoning. They came up one at a time. An old farmer, shaking so hard he could barely stand, who told how the prefect's men broke his father's leg over a grain tax the family couldn't pay, and how his father died slow of it through a winter. A woman whose younger sister had been taken in the night and never came home. A merchant ruined on a charge everyone knew was invented. It poured out of that square, years of it, a whole city's worth of grief that had never once had a safe place to land, and it landed all at once, on a man kneeling on a platform, and there was nothing left of the swaggering prefect by the end, but a thing weeping for its life. And when the last voice had spoken, someone in the crowd shouted the thing I'd been waiting for since I raised the banner. Write it down, a blood petition. Let the whole empire see what these beasts did to us. They brought paper and brushes, and the people surged forward, and one after another they bit their own fingers and pressed bright red thumbprints onto the pages, hundreds of them, then thousands, an entire city signing its suffering in its own blood, and every fingerprint was an accusation, and every accusation ran up the same ladder to the same name at the top, not just the prefect who did it, the man who appointed him, protected him, and took his cut. Grand Commandant Li Tao, the old fox who'd killed my mother, now drowning, one red thumbprint at a time. In a flood, I'd only had to give a direction. I stood on that platform and watched a city write my mother's revenge in its own blood and call it justice, and I'm not going to pretend those two things weren't the same thing wearing two faces. They were. That was the whole art of it. Li Tao had spent years making enemies in the dark, and I was simply handing all of them a pen at once. And here's the part that made it a trap and not just an accusation, the part I'd built into it from the start. For 40 years, Li Tao had run the South like a private estate, and the whole art of it was that none of the filth ever touched him. Somebody else stole the land, somebody else ate the relief grain, and the silver just arrived, clean, up 100 quiet channels, while he was called a pillar of the state. That distance had kept him untouchable. And now that same distance was a noose because he could no longer even defend himself without hanging himself. To call the petitions lies, he'd have to explain why it was always his students. To send an army south to burn the witnesses, he'd have to explain why the Grand Commandant was so very eager to burn a province full of them. Every move that could save him confessed him instead. He'd spent a lifetime building a web nothing could reach him through, and I'd turned it, thread by thread, into the one thing he couldn't climb out of. Wang Mingde went to the block, and the land went back, and the granaries opened, and Jianyang decided, loudly in the streets, that the exiled Ruran prince was the only honest official the empire had left. Not everyone folded quietly, though. Chunxiang put up a fight, and Chunxiang is worth telling because it's the day I watched Bai Songshan prove he was more than a poet. Its governor, a Li Tao man named Qin Guoji, was cornered and vicious about it. When the divine martial army arrived, he did the thing only a truly rotten man does. He dragged the city's old people and women and children up onto the wall, roped them to the battlements, and shouted down that if we attacked, they died with him. Hua Yanwu nearly came off his horse. He wanted to charge the wall then and there, hostages be damned, and cut that dog in half, and I understood the feeling. But Bai Songshan rode across his path and stopped him. Not like this, brother. His Highness just won 2 provinces' hearts. Kill a wall full of grandmothers and we hand them all back in one afternoon. So they didn't attack. They surrounded. And Bai Songshan found the city's throat and squeezed it. The supply roads, the grain coming in, cut them quietly, all of them. And then he waited. Here's what Qin Guoji never understood. 100,000 hungry people packed inside a wall aren't a shield. They're a fire. And he was standing in the middle of it, holding the only water. Within days, the rations shrank. Within a week, the city understood that its own governor was hoarding grain behind guards while their children thinned, and that the prince outside was feeding the villages this same governor had bled. My quiet men only had to point. The city rose from the inside. They tore the ropes off their own grandmothers on that wall, they threw the gate open themselves, and they handed Qin Guoji to Hua Yanwu gift-wrapped in his own soldiers. Not one hostage died, and that, more than any battle, is the thing that made the South mine, because they didn't just fear my army, they trusted it more than the men who were supposed to protect them. After that, the story ran ahead of my soldiers like fire through dry grass. In city after city, I didn't even have to fight for the ending anymore. The people got there first. Let me give you Nanxiang, because Nanxiang is the one that taught me how completely the game had changed. Nanxiang was the seat of Yue province, and its governor, a Li Tao creature named Tang Jian, was cleverer than the rest. When he saw my army coming, he did the ruthless thing. He burned the countryside, dragged every villager and every grain of food inside the walls, sealed the gates, and sat behind 3 full granaries with 12,000 men, planning to wait me out until the capital sent help. On paper, it was a hard nut. High walls, water on 3 sides, months of food. I didn't crack it. I let it crack itself. Because Tang Jian had made one mistake, the same mistake all of them made. He thought the 150,000 people he jammed into that city were assets. Feng Jing knew better. While my army sat outside handing out grain to the villages Tang Jian had abandoned, my quiet men, Guo Shu's people, already inside the walls dressed as refugees, went to work on the crowded, hungry, furious crowd Tang Jian had trapped with him. They didn't have to lie. They just had to point. Your grain is in his granaries. Your children are hungry because he's hoarding it. The prince outside is feeding the people he left in the fields, while your own governor starves you behind his walls. It took 9 days. I had a man inside named He Yuan, one of Guo Shu's, a quiet fellow who'd let himself be swept up into the city with the refugees, so he'd be trapped in there with the very people I meant to turn. He found the village headmen, the ones the crowd trusted, and he didn't have to invent a single lie to move them. The rations were shrinking a little more every day. A man had already been whipped bloody at a grain line for asking why. He Yuan just told them the true thing that hurt worst. Your grain is full to the roof in his 3 granaries, and your children are thin because he's hoarding it, and the prince outside the walls is feeding the villagers this governor threw away. The headman already half knew it. He only had to say it out loud. On the 9th night, a dark and windy one, it all came due at once. At the East Granary, one of my people had spent 3 days befriending the guards with good wine, and on the 9th night the wine was doped, and once they were snoring, he and a dozen shadows poured oil over the grain and lit it, and were gone before the beams fell. When the fire went up, the district that had been shorted its rations one time too many chose that exact moment to riot, thousands of them swarming the guards over a bowl of rice. And while the governor's men ran to fight the fire and the mob, my quiet men set the other 2 granaries alight and slipped through the emptying streets to the north gate where the fewest defenders stood. They took the governor, Tang Jian, in his own hall. The man had actually been drinking with a concubine, so certain of his walls that he'd left the fires to underlings, and they put a blade to his back and walked him to the north gate and made him give the order himself. When the gate ground open, Guanjian's cavalry, waiting in the dark, came in like a black river, and they came in shouting the one order I never stopped giving: protect the people, kill any soldier caught cutting down civilians. A city that had braced to be sacked watched my horsemen ride down the looters instead, and that was the last argument Nanxiang ever needed. 150,000 people I could never have fought my way past had done the work for me, because Tang Jian gave them a reason to hate him, and I gave them a reason to hope, and hope wins that fight every single time. That was the whole province in the end. Not conquest, contagion. Feng Jing ran the same play a dozen ways. Take the tyrant alive, try him in the square, return the stolen land, open the grain, let the people write the blood petition. And it worked, because underneath the strategy, it was simply true. The Li Tao machine had spent a generation making the South hate it. All I did was give the hate somewhere to go and put my banner over the exit. By the time the last city of Yue fell, I held a whole province. The blood petitions were being copied by the hundreds and carried north on every road, and a single name was being cursed in every market square from the border to the capital, Li Tao. Somewhere in a warm mansion in the capital, the man who'd killed my mother was about to find out that the son he'd helped throw away had grown up, come back with an army, and taught 2 provinces to say his name like a curse. I hoped it kept him up at night. I intended for it to keep him up for the rest of them. Province, next door, fell to a trick so clean I want it carved on something. Its governor, Zhou Fu, was a coward of the most useful kind, a man whose entire career was built on seeking no merit and making no mistakes, which meant that the instant a real decision landed on him, he froze. So Feng Jing didn't attack coup, he performed attacking coup. Bai Songshan marched up to a border city and put on a very loud, very convincing show of a massive siege, drums, ladders, assaults that always stopped a hair short of the wall, while Hua Yanwu sat quiet on the other flank. The governor of Yue's neighbor panicked exactly as designed and begged Zhou Fu for reinforcements. And Zhou Fu, terrified of being blamed for standing by, did the cowardly cautious thing. He pulled troops out of Xin'an, a remote city he figured was safe, and sent them off to help. The moment Xin'an was hollow, Hua Yanwu took it in a morning, and the gate to Ku province swung open. After that, Feng Jing simply refused to let Zhou Fu have a single quiet hour to think. Hua Yanwu's cavalry harried 5 counties at once. Here today, 30 li away by nightfall, a granary burned in the east while a garrison surrendered in the west, so that every report reaching the provincial capital contradicted the last, and a man whose one talent was avoiding blame drowned in a flood of decisions he couldn't make. You cannot defend a province you can't find the front of. Zhou Fu kept his troops marching in circles chasing a war that was everywhere and nowhere, and every circle left another city undefended behind him. Only one of them made me get up out of my chair. At Xiang the prefect, a Li Tao man with more spite than sense, stood on his wall as Hua Yanwu came over it and screamed the one insult these people always reached for, that a filthy mongrel with Roran blood in his veins had no right to touch a true official of the empire, that I was a stain, a barbarian, an animal wearing a prince's title. Hua Yanwu, who had listened to men mock his lord's blood exactly one time too many, walked the length of that wall to him through everything the garrison could put in the way, and did not say a single word back, because some insults you answer with a speech, and some you answer by simply arriving. The prefect stopped screaming when he understood no wall between them was going to hold. It was the last thing about the empire he ever got wrong. After Xiang, the province folded fast, because Zhou Fu could no more hold a real war than he could fly. He surrendered his cities and then fled his own capital through a side gate with a few chests of gold and his own family left behind to fate, which tells you everything about the kind of men Li Tao had running the south. We caught him on the road. His confession, written in a shaking hand, added Li Tao's name to the blood petitions one more time, and the whole while I kept pulling the banner, and the banner kept answering the way it answers a man it has decided to take seriously. I drew Ma Mingyuan, a 4-star, the Tang dynasty's divine general, and with him came the thing that would break the empire's cavalry across my knee, the Modao army, 1,000 men in triple armor, each carrying a Modao, a great 2-handed blade, a full zhang and 2 long, heavy enough that swinging one takes 3 years of training and a back like a bull. In a phalanx, they are a wall that walks, and against horse they are the single most terrifying thing on any battlefield, because a Modao doesn't parry a charging warhorse. It takes its legs off. When they materialized on my drill ground, even I went quiet. 1,000 men in black triple armor, and Ma Mingyuan at the head of them, 7 feet of him, a face like a dark date, carrying a Modao, a good 10 caddies heavier than his men's like it weighed nothing at all. He knelt, and behind him 1,000 knelt with a sound like a mountain settling, and then he stood and asked me, plainly, no ceremony in him, how his lord meant to use them. I asked for a demonstration. I wanted to see the thing the histories promised. They formed up. On a shouted word, the great blades came up in a single motion, a wall of edges taller than a man, and then Ma Mingyuan had them run their drills, the phalanx shifting, tightening, the 9-man packs peeling off and folding back, the blades coming down in unison in strokes that would have taken a horse's legs at the knee or split a rider and his saddle in one fall. There was no wasted motion in any of it. 1,000 men moving like one enormous patient animal, and the ground shaking a little under the weight of them. And even Hua Yanwu, who fears nothing that breathes, watched with his jaw set, because he understood better than anyone what a cavalry charge would do against that, which was die. Once, in the histories, 5,000 of these men fought an entire rebel host at a temple in a battle so terrible that both sides kept fighting past 60% dead. Ma Mingyuan had been there. He'd carried the Modao at the front of it, and now he carried it for me. Divine General, I said, the Empire is going to send its cavalry down that road eventually, all of it. He looked at his wall of blades, and then at me, and the old soldier almost smiled. Then let them come, my lord. We take legs. I drew Gongjeng and his Xiandeng death warriors, 3,000 light infantry bred for one purpose. They go up a wall first, into the arrows, the rolling stones, the boiling oil, grappling hooks and light ladders, and a disregard for their own lives that isn't bravado, it's training. 30 of every 100 died just learning to be one of them. Where the Modao held ground, the Xiandeng took it. Between the two of them, there was no city I couldn't open and no charge I couldn't stop. Ling Province, the last of the three, cost a little more because its governor had actually watched what happened to the other two and tried to be clever about it. He was still too slow. Bai Songshan opened by laying siege to a border city called Chong'an, and this time the siege wasn't entirely theater, because now I had the Xiandeng. My 3,000 stormtroops got their first real wall, and they went up it exactly the way the histories promised, grappling hooks and light ladders into the arrows and the rolling stones, the front rank buying the wall for the rank behind with their own bodies and not one man slowing down, until the top of Chong'an was theirs before its defenders had finished deciding whether the assault was real. It was very real. The governor of Ling, hearing that his border city was actually falling, did the thing every one of them did. He stripped his own capital and flung the garrison down the road to save Chong'an. That relief column was 5,000 men under a general named Sun Bin, and it never reached the fight. Hua Yanwu was waiting on the road with the divine martial army, in ground of his choosing, and he took a marching column strung out between two tree lines and folded it up before it could form a line to defend itself. The worst way in the world to meet Hua Yanwu being on the move, unready, and late. By the time the noise of it died, Bai Songshan was already inside the emptied capital of Tengyun, a quiet man opening a gate from within, and the governor, Ouyang Bo, was in a cell before he'd fully understood that he'd been robbed of his whole province by a shout aimed at the wrong city. And with that, the whole southern territory was mine. 3 provinces, not a wasteland corner anymore. A country with a spine of fortresses, 100 fields where there'd been weeds, granaries that were full, an army no single province could match, and a population that had gone from starving to fed and now, increasingly, to armed and grateful and mine. The system marked it with a chime I felt in my teeth. Ding, special achievement, the dagger revealed at the end of the map. Reward, 1,000,000 points. 1,000,000 points. I stood in the hall of my newest captured palace and looked at that number and understood finally the full size of the thing I was holding. I could summon 100,000 loyal refugees with that and barely feel it. I could buy grain for years, iron for a war, masters to teach a generation. My father had sent me to a hole to die, and the hole had turned out to have a door in the bottom of it that opened onto everything. But I'd also just done a thing that couldn't be undone, and I knew it. Taking the southern wilderness, the capital could ignore. Killing a garrison commander, they could explain away. Even the 80,000 dead southern Li could be spun as a loyal prince defending the border a little too enthusiastically, but 3 imperial provinces seized, their governors tried in the streets, 50,000 of the emperor's own soldiers buried in a valley, and blood petitions with my father's grand commandant's name at the top of every one that could not be ignored. That was a knife held to the throne itself. Feng Jing, ever cautious, counseled patience. The southern territory is stable now, my lord. Build, consolidate. Don't rush to claim a crown. It invites the whole empire down on us before we're ready. Stay Prince of Nanan, advance step by step. He was right, and I told him he was right, and I meant it. There'd be no crown yet, no march on the capital yet. Not because I didn't want it. I wanted it the way a starving man wants bread, but because I'd built this whole thing on patience, and I wasn't going to throw that away for the pleasure of a title 1 season too early. But wanting and doing are different clocks, and I could hear both of them ticking, because up north, the news had finally landed, all of it, at once, and my father, who had spent my whole life not looking at me, was about to have no choice but to look. I heard about the capital the way I heard about everything now, through Guo Shu's people, who had by this point put quiet eyes in half the tea houses and one very useful clerk in the Ministry of War itself, so I got the whole show secondhand, and I enjoyed it more than anything I'd watched in person in years. It started with a Southern Li envoy, The dynasty whose 80,000 I'd buried at the river had decided the smartest possible move was to send a man to my father's court and demand satisfaction, because from their side, the exiled prince who'd wrecked their army was still, technically, a Baekchuan problem. So this envoy, Liu Fan, swept into the Golden Luan Hall and did the one thing guaranteed to ruin my father's entire month. He informed the whole court, out loud, in front of every minister, that His Majesty's discarded seventh son had slaughtered 80,000 Southern Li troops in a wasteland the court had forgotten existed. You have to understand what that did to that room. These were men who'd spent a decade agreeing I was nothing, and now a foreign envoy was standing on the imperial floor practically laughing at them. A discarded pawn did this, and you didn't even know? And then, because he had no mercy at all, he reached for the exact same knife everyone in that court always reached for. His mother was the Ruran princess, wasn't she? When Ruran rebelled, and now he has an army in the south. One does wonder if he might repeat his mother's mistake. My father sat on his throne and had to eat all of it because the alternative was admitting to a foreign power that Baekchuan had lost control of 3 of its own provinces. I'd have paid a great deal to see his face. My spies said it was worth the price. They also brought me the private version, later, and I confess I read it more than once. Because that night, alone in his study, my father came apart in a way he never would in front of the court. He'd shattered a teacup against the floor. He was pacing. And the thing he kept coming back to, my people had a eunuch close enough to hear it, wasn't strategy, it was me, that mixed blood good for nothing, just like his Ruran mother, rebellious to the marrow. I should have finished him with her 20 years ago and been done with it. All the venom he'd never once spent looking at me while I stood in his hall poured out into an empty room now that I was too far away to reach. And under the venom, this is the part I keep, there was fear, real fear, for the first time. Because a great general he trusted had gone south with 50,000 men and simply vanished, because 2 enemy armies had died on my river. Because the son he'd thrown in a hole had climbed out holding a country he'd spent my whole life certain of exactly how little I was worth, and the certainty had cracked, and a man like my father would rather feel anything than uncertainty about his own judgment. My brothers felt it too in their own studies, over their own cold tea. The crown prince, who'd toasted my death a year before, sat wondering how the useless one had eaten 130,000 soldiers between them. Xiao Rui, who'd sent assassins after my carriage, kept very quiet, and Li Tao, the spider at the center of it all, had gone from cornered to drowning and knew it. None of them said the word out loud, but they were all, finally, thinking it. The mixed-blood prince is dangerous. And then, before the envoy had even left the city, the rest of it came home to roost. The silence from the south explained at last. Xiao Ren had raised an army and rebelled. Yue and Ku seized, their governors dead in the streets. 50,000 troops sent to deal with him, gone, vanished, not one messenger returned. And on top of all of it, blood petitions from 2 whole provinces flooding into the capital, thousands of red thumbprints, every one of them pointing at Grand Commandant Li Tao. That last part was my favorite, because it put Li Tao in a vice of my building. He knelt in front of my father swearing it was all slander, and my father, who is many things but not stupid, looked at him and asked the one question that had no good answer. Why is it always your disciples? Why is it always the provinces your students govern? And Li Tao had nothing, because there was nothing, because it was all true. I hadn't invented a single crime. I'd only handed a pen to every victim of his the same week. The court, meanwhile, held a trial of a man who wasn't there. My spies gave me the whole session, the ministers lining up to demand my head, the rebel, the traitor, the mongrel who'd slaughtered imperial officials and buried an army, exterminate his line, and so on. And leading the pack, loudest of all, biting his own finger for emphasis, Grand Commandant Li Tao, because a man drowning in blood petitions, with his own name at the top, has one move left, and it's to shout traitor louder than anyone so nobody looks too hard at why every accusation runs to his door, strip his rank, hunt him down, send the army. He wanted me dead faster than my father did, and for worse reasons. The one honest voice, old Zhao Ming, Minister of Rights, the man who'd once tried to argue me 30,000 soldiers instead of a spoon, started to say something about imperial blood, and got glared into silence. It's a lonely thing, being the only decent man in a room full of knives. I've always had a soft spot for him. And through all of it, the Southern Li envoy sat there and offered, helpfully, that his dynasty would be delighted to send troops to help crush the rebel, because of course they would. 2 of my father's provinces bleeding into a civil war was the best news Southern Li had gotten in a generation. My father wasn't fool enough to take it, but he couldn't unsay it in front of the court either, and every minister in that hall now had the picture in his head. The empire so weak, it might need a foreign army to put down one exiled son. My father's rage, when it finally came, was the cold kind. He stripped me of my princely rank. I was no longer the 7th prince, I was simply the rebel Xiaoren, to be hunted across the empire, and anyone who aided me would share my fate. Fine, I'd been a prince my whole life, and it had never protected me. Losing the word cost me nothing. What he did next was the part that mattered. He sent Qinzhan. Now, I want you to take Qinzhan seriously, because I did. Every other enemy the capital had thrown at me had been a Ma Kai, a Wang Hai, a Wu Yun, proud men who underestimated me and died of it. Qinzhan was different. He was Baixuan's foremost general, the real thing, a man who had once broken 100,000 Ruran with 30,000 of his own on the northern frontier and never in a long, bloody career tasted defeat. He didn't underestimate anyone. That was the whole point of him. When my father handed him 100,000 troops and pointed them south, he wasn't sending another arrogant fool to feed my legend. He was sending the one man built specifically not to lose to someone like me. My spies got me a picture of Qinzhan in his tent the night before he marched, and it told me everything. He wasn't drinking to his own legend or boasting to his officers. He was sitting alone with a lamp and a stack of intelligence reports on my generals, reading them one at a time, slowly, the way you read a contract you intend to hold someone to. He lingered longest on Huayanwu, the might of 10,000 men, bloodthirsty, once charged a formation alone and killed 1,000 Chu, and where a lesser man would have seen a monster to fear, Qinzhan saw a lever to pull. A fierce general with that temper, he murmured to his aide, has a fatal flaw in a siege. He can't sit still. Provoke him enough and he'll leave his walls to come and be a hero, and a general who leaves his walls has already lost. He wrote 2 words on a slip and set it aside. The strategy of provocation. He was, I'll be honest, completely right about the kind of general Huayanwu usually was. What he couldn't read off a report was that Feng Jing had spent months teaching my fiend the one thing fiends never learn, patience, and that the cold, still, unbaitable man, Qinzhan, would meet on the wall of Nanjian Pass was going to hand his own excellent plan right back to him. But that's the thing about a careful man. He prepares perfectly for the enemy he can see. Feng Jing's whole art was making sure he never quite saw the right one. My spies caught the shape of Qinzhan's plan almost as soon as he had it, because a careful general is also a legible one. He does the correct thing, and the correct thing can be read. He split his 100,000 into 3. 30,000 under a general called Feng Hong into the mountains of Yue to threaten my flank. 10,000 light cavalry under a general named Zhao Ling, Baixuan's finest woman of war, a name even I'd heard, to menace the eastern border, and 60,000 the main body under his own hand straight at Nanjian Pass, the choke where I'd already broken one army. 3 prongs, designed to make me split my forces to answer all of them, so that whichever one he chose to hit for real would find the door thin. It was, I'll be honest, a genuinely good plan. It was the plan a man makes when he assumes his enemy is smart, resourceful, and dangerous, which is to say, it was the first plan any of them had made that treated me as real. I sat with the map that night, and Feng Jing sat across from me, and for the first time since the throne room, I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel about a fight. I felt like I was actually going to have to earn this one. He's good, Feng Jing said quietly, tapping Qinzhan's 3 prongs. This is the first commander they've sent who won't hand us the victory. He'll make us take it. Good, I said, and I meant it, and I was a little surprised to find I meant it. I'm tired of being handed things by fools. Let's beat a real one. Feng Jing smiled the tired, dangerous smile I'd come to love. Then we don't answer 3 prongs with 3 answers, my lord. A careful man's great weakness is that he trusts what he confirms. So we'll be very sure to let him confirm exactly the wrong things. The poet unrolled a fresh sheet and dipped his brush. Let me show you, he said, how to lie to a man who checks. Feng Jing's whole plan hung on one truth about careful men. They don't trust what they're told, they trust what they check. So he built a lie sturdy enough to survive checking. Qinzhan wanted to know if I'd split my forces to answer his 3 prongs. So we let him find out that I had. Bai Songshan took 5,000 of the Divine Might army north into Yue's mountains, but first he dressed every one of them as the Divine Martial Army. New banners, Hua Yanwu's heavy black armor, the exact camp layout, the exact way Hua Yanwu's men fed their horses and stood their watches. When Fang Hong's scouts crept up and studied that camp for a day and a night, everything they saw said the same thing. This is Hua Yanwu's army, pulled off the pass to guard the flank. Qinzhan, being Qinzhan, didn't believe the scouts. He ordered a night probe, a real one, blades out, to test whether the equipment and the fighting style were genuine, because banners can be sewn and camps can be copied, but a soldier's trained reflexes can't be faked in a week. And that was the moment Feng Jing had bet the whole war on, because he'd spent that week doing the one thing nobody expected, teaching Bai Songshan's men to fight like Hua Yanwu's. The armor was real system armor. The blades were real. And when Fang Hong's probe hit them in the dark, the divine martial army fought back with exactly the steady, brutal, unmistakable rhythm of Hua Yanwu's veterans, because for 1 week, that's what they drilled to be. And I will tell you honestly that this is the closest the whole war ever came to falling apart, and I didn't sleep the night it happened. Because a man can drill a fighting rhythm into his hands in a week, but fear is older than any drill, and somewhere in that black scuffle, a young soldier of the Divine Might Army took a bad cut, and for one heartbeat, started to fight the way his body actually knew how to fight. His own style, not the borrowed one. Right in front of a probing officer whose entire job that night was to notice exactly that. My whole campaign, 3 provinces and 40,000 men and a year of my life, hung for one breath on whether one frightened boy would remember to lie with his sword while bleeding. What saved it wasn't luck. It was that Feng Jing, who thinks of everything, had paired every green man in that formation with a real veteran at his shoulder, and the veteran beside the boy killed the curious officer half a second before curiosity could become a report. Half a second. That's the margin the South was won by, and nobody in it but me and Feng Jing ever knew the door had even been open. That is the thing about fighting a careful man. You don't beat him comfortably. You beat him by a half second in the dark and spend the rest of your life not thinking about how close it ran. Feng Hong wrote to Qin Zhan and swore on it. Confirmed. The Divine Martial Army has split off to the mountains. Qin Zhan had checked the way he always checked, and the check had lied to him the way Feng Jing had promised it would. Which meant Nanjian Pass, where Qin Zhan was about to throw his real weight, was, as far as he knew, thinly held. It was held by 20,000 men and Hua Yanwu, but before the pass there was the eastern border, and Zhaoling, and the debut I'd been waiting for. Zhaoling was the real thing. Baixuan's finest woman of war, 10,000 light cavalry behind her, and a fighter's instinct that had never once led her wrong. She came at my eastern flank fast and probing, expecting the same thin garrison she'd been told to expect. What she found, waiting for her on open ground, was 1,000 men standing in 3 ranks of black iron, holding blades taller than they were. She'd never seen a Modao army, almost nobody alive had, so she did the thing every cavalry commander does when they see infantry standing in the open. She charged them. 10,000 of the Empire's best horse, thundering down on 1,000 men on foot, and I imagine she was already composing the report in her head. Then the front rank of the Modao army raised those great blades, and the world stopped making the kind of sense a cavalry general is used to, because a Modao doesn't meet a charging horse the way a spear does. A spear you can ride onto and still crash through. A Modao comes down and takes the horse's legs, and a horse with no legs is not a battering ram. It's an avalanche of its own weight falling on the rider behind it. The first rank of Zhaoling's charge went down into a wall it couldn't break, and the ranks behind, too fast, too committed, piled into their own fallen. The Modao army just waited and worked, calm as men mowing a field. She was too good to keep throwing horses at it, so she tried everything else. She pulled back and had her archers rake the phalanx from range, and the Modao men set those great broad blades in front of them like shields, and the arrows rang off the steel and the triple armor and did nothing. She sent riders wide to hit the flanks, and Ma Mingyuan's formation flowered open into 9-man packs, 3 to cut the horse, 3 for the rider, 3 to finish, each little knot fighting on its own and folding back into the hole whenever she pushed. There was no soft edge. There was no soft anything. Whatever she brought, the wall had already answered it before she committed, because Ma Mingyuan read the battle like a page and shifted his ranks a half step at a time to close every gap the instant she found it. An hour. That's how long it took 1,000 men on foot to destroy 10,000 of the finest cavalry in the Empire. And Zhaoling, to her enormous credit, didn't break and didn't run. She fought her way through her own dying command to the front, sword and horse and fury, looking for the general who'd built this nightmare, and when she finally reached Ma Mingyuan, she was covered in wounds and still swinging. Ma Mingyuan did a thing I didn't order and wouldn't have thought to. He stopped the killing around her, and he offered her a duel, himself, one arm held behind his back, 3 moves to land a single strike on him and go free, because he'd watched her fight 1,000 men without breaking, and to a soldier of his age that kind of courage is worth more than a corpse. She took the offer, of course. She'd have died before she didn't. And she couldn't touch him. An exhausted, wounded fighter against a man who was, historically, one of the deadliest blades China ever produced, one-armed or not. But she made him work for every parry, and when she finally went down, it was from a strike to the shoulder, not a killing blow, because he'd chosen to take her alive. They brought her to me later, disarmed, bandaged, still refusing to bend her neck a single degree. I asked her, genuinely curious, why a woman that good was spending her one life dying for a court that had thrown its own son into a hole and sent her to clean up the mess. She looked at me the way you look at something beneath answering and said she'd sworn an oath, and an oath doesn't check whether the throne deserves it. I told her the throne she'd sworn to had hounded my mother into a cold palace and left a 6-year-old to be called bastard for a decade, and had then, when that son refused to conveniently die, sent her 10,000 riders to finish the job. And I asked her whether an oath to men like that was honor, or just obedience wearing honor's coat. She didn't flinch. The oath isn't to the men, she said. It's to the word. If I only keep my word to people who earn it, then it was never worth anything. It was just a trade I hadn't closed yet. You wouldn't understand. A pause, and then, with the first flicker of something almost like contempt, though I hear you keep yours. So maybe you understand better than you're letting on. And that shut me up, honestly, because she was right, and because it was the exact thing I'd built my whole cold little reputation on, that my word, unlike my father's, was a knife that always landed. I just never had it turned back on me by a woman I'd spent 1,000 men to capture. I didn't push. I've come to think that's the rarest thing in the whole rotten empire, rarer than talent, rarer than courage even, a person who keeps a word simply because it's theirs, with nothing owed back. The capital was stuffed floor to ceiling with men who'd sold their spines for a warm office and a soft chair. Here was one of the few people the throne had ever sent me who actually had one, and I found I couldn't bring myself to break it, so I housed her well and left her alone, an enemy I'd rather keep than bury, and filed the whole thing under lessons about which of my father's servants were worth something, and which were just furniture that could talk. But that's not the part that mattered. The part that mattered was the letter Zhao Ling had sent north before the trap closed, and the one Feng Hong had sent from the mountains, both saying the same confirmed, checked, absolutely verified thing. Hua Yanwu's divine martial army is split off, guarding the flanks. Nanjian Pass is thin. Qin Jan, careful Qin Jan, foremost General Qin Jan, read both letters, trusted the checking he'd done because checking had never failed him before, and turned his 60,000 toward a pass he believed was held by a skeleton. He was, at that exact moment, the best informed man in the empire about a war that existed only in Feng Jing's imagination. And Hua Yanwu was standing on the wall of Nanjian Pass with 20,000 men and a very patient smile, watching 60,000 of the emperor's soldiers march toward him under the confident command of a man who thought he'd already read the board. The thing about Nanjian Pass is that it doesn't care how good you are. I should tell you what Hua Yanwu had done to that pass, because it's the part of him people never expect. Everyone knows the fiend on the horse. Nobody expects the man who takes his armor off, puts on a laborer's short shirt, and hauls bluestone up a wall alongside his own soldiers for a month because the pass is home now, and you don't leave your home half-mended. He'd found Nanjian Pass a crumbling 300-year-old ruin, and he rebuilt it into a nightmare, and he did it with the help of an old white-haired mason among the refugees who turned out to be worth more than a legion. The two of them went over that fortress stone by stone, new bluestone facing set in mortar cut with glutinous rice paste and tung oil so it dried harder than the rock it replaced. The whole inner wall backed with 3 zhang of rammed earth, a layer of soil, a layer of grass, tamped flat, and then the outer face poured over with molten scrap iron until it cooled into a skin no ram could bite. Ironwood arrow towers, fireproof, each mounting a bed crossbow that threw 10 bolts at once. A moat dug at the foot of the wall, 3 zhang wide, floored with dry brush and doused in oil, 1 torch away from a wall of flame. Iron caltrops sewn thick across every approach, the wicked little things that always land spike up and ruin a horse's hoof no matter how they fall. And the part I loved best, the part that was pure Hua Yanwu, hidden firing ports built into the base of the wall, sealed flush with matching stones so that from the outside they simply didn't exist, each one hiding an oversized repeating crossbow built for exactly one purpose, punching through siege engines at spitting distance. He built a trap into the wall itself, and then made the wall lie about it. When it was done, he stood on the tower looking north up the empty road, and he recited, of all things, an old poem carved into the pass by some defender 3 centuries dead, about holding this gate against 100,000 with 3,000 men. The pass locks the first city of the southern sky. He meant it as a promise. I've kept the memory of it because it's the truest thing about him. The man kills like weather. But he chose on his own to memorize the poem of a dead soldier who'd once held the same stones, and to swear he'd hold them too. Qinjian reached it and did everything right, which was the frustrating part for him. He didn't hurl his men at the wall like Wu Yun had. He probed, he tested, he brought up trebuchets and cracked the outer stone, and found the rammed earth and poured iron behind it, and understood he'd need a week of pounding for a breach that Hua Yanwu could seal in a night. He built goose carts, armored siege sheds, 10 men each, proof against arrows and fire, and rolled them to the base of the wall to chew through it, and it was a genuinely clever piece of engineering. Hua Yanwu let them get right up against the stone, Then he opened the firing ports. Nobody knew the ports were there. They'd been built into the base of the wall and sealed with matching stone, invisible, and behind each one sat a heavy repeating crossbow, throwing bolts as thick as your arm, and 10 feet long, weapons built for exactly one job, which was punching through siege engines at spitting distance. When they fired, Qinzhan's beautiful goose carts got skewered where they stood, wheels nailed to the ground. The whole clever assault turned into a row of expensive coffins in the space of a few breaths. And here is the detail that told me I was fighting a real man, the thing that made Qinzhan different from every fool before him. He didn't rage. He didn't throw good men after bad to save his pride. He looked at his ruined carts and his skewered engines, and he pulled back and said, essentially, this pass will cost me my whole army if I force it, and I have 2 more passes behind it. I will not be baited into bleeding out here. And he settled in to wait, and to think, and to be patient, because patience had never once betrayed him. Which was the exact moment Feng Jing sprang the trap, because Feng Jing had been counting on Qinzhan's patience the way you count on gravity, because Qinzhan's caution had a shape, and the shape was this: he would not commit fully until he was certain, and we had spent this whole campaign making him certain of things that weren't true. He was certain the Divine Might army was off in the mountains guarding my flank. He was certain the pass was thinly held by a stretched garrison. He was certain, from every checked and confirmed report on his desk, that if he made one hard, decisive push, the thin defense would break. So Feng Jing gave him the push. Bai Songshan, whose army Qinzhan believed was 100 li away wearing the wrong banners, quietly brought the Divine Might army back through the mountains in the dark and hid it in the tree lines outside the pass. And then we let Qinzhan see an opening. A gate undermanned. A wall section thinning. Bait, laid for a careful man. In the one currency a careful man can't resist. The appearance of a sure thing. Qinzhan took it. Of course he took it. It was the correct move, given everything he knew, and everything he knew was Feng Jing's design. He committed his central army to one hard, decisive assault to crack the thin pass open, and the thin pass was 20,000 men, and the mountains were empty of the Divine Might army, because the Divine Might army was in the trees at his back, and the moment his central army was fully committed against the wall, Huayanwu threw the gates open and came out into them, and Bai Songshan came out of the tree lines behind them, and the 60,000 who thought they were breaking a skeleton found themselves crushed between a fortress and a ghost army with a river at their flank. It came apart fast, the way a careful plan does when its one wrong assumption finally shows all at once, catastrophically, with no time to adjust. Qinzhan's central army, the core of 100,000, was shattered against the walls of a pass he'd been told was empty, and Qinzhan himself, the foremost general of Baishuan, the man who had never lost, he went down with it. Not because he was a fool. Because he'd played a careful, correct, excellent game against an opponent who'd spent 3 provinces and a month learning to lie to careful men, and the one time it mattered, my lie had held and his certainty hadn't. I felt something strange hearing it. Not triumph exactly, respect mostly. He was the only one of them who'd earned a fair fight, and I hadn't given him one. I'd given him a rigged board and let his own excellence walk him across it. But that's what winning against a better general is. You don't beat him at the thing he's better at. You make sure the fight is never about that thing at all. That left Fang Hong and his 30,000 sitting in the mountains, guarding a flank of a war that had already ended without him. I'm told the moment the news reached his tent is the moment the whole beautiful trap came clear to him at once, too late to matter. A scout, ashen, on one knee, Qin commander led the assault on Lancong Pass, ambushed, the central army, all of it, gone, the commander's fate unknown. Fang Hong took the man by the collar and made him say it twice, because the sentence didn't fit inside a world he understood. Qinzhan, the undefeated one. The whole reason the southern campaign was supposed to be safe, gone, and in the silence after the second telling, he did the arithmetic every doomed commander eventually does and watched it come out wrong. The divine martial army in the mountains had been a costume. The thin pass had been bait. His own scouts' confirmations, the ones he'd trusted, the ones Zhao Ling had trusted, had been walking his certainty into a hole the entire time, and Zhao Ling herself, his right hand, 10,000 iron cavalry, already trapped, already taken, 3 days gone. Of 100,000 men, he had fewer than 30,000 left, and Bai Songshan's drums were already sounding in the dawn. So Feng Hong made the only choice a trapped man can make, which is the least bad one on a table with no good ones. Standing and fighting Bai Songshan meant being pinned and ground down. So he ordered a fighting retreat, the vanguard to die in place buying time, the rest to pull back fast and quiet by the shortest hidden road out of the mountains. He was not a fool, he even felt the wrongness of it, and sent elite scouts ahead to sweep the route, because a narrow road is exactly where a man like Feng Jing would be waiting. He did everything right, he just did it inside a plan that had already accounted for everything right. The fastest, most hidden route ran through a place called Broken Soul Valley. Cliffs on both sides like axe cuts, a floor only a few zhang wide, mist pooling in the mornings, the kind of ground where 30,000 men have to string out into a thin snake because there is no room on earth to be anything else. Hua Yanwu had been lying on those cliffs since the afternoon, 3,000 men in gray cloaks stitched with branches pressed flat against the rock, not a fire, not a sound, boulders and cut logs already levered into place along the rim. I'll spare you the worst of it because it wasn't a battle, and I've never dressed the ugly parts up as glory. But I'll tell you the shape of it because the shape is Feng Jing's whole genius. Fang Hong was no fool. He sent scouts ahead into the valley, 3 groups, 15 men, to sweep the rims and the road. Not one came back. And a careful commander, feeling the first cold finger of dread, knows exactly what 15 vanished scouts means. But by the time he knew it, his army was already in the throat of the thing, front and rear both swallowed by stone, and to turn 30,000 frightened men around in a corridor that fits 4 abreast is not a retreat, it's a stampede into your own spears. The valley had gone unnaturally quiet, no birds, no insects, just the shuffle of his own men and the drip of the mist, and every soldier in that column felt the wrongness of it crawling up his neck, and there was nothing any of them could do but keep walking deeper because the men behind kept pushing. Fang Hong looked up at the cliffs in the thinning fog and saw, at last, the thing that had been there the whole time, cold points of light strung all along both rims, hundreds of them, the reflection off 10,000 arrowheads already drawn. Then Hua Yanwu lifted his spear, and the rims opened, and the valley took Fang Hong's army the way the swamp had taken the elephants, all at once, with nowhere to go, the safe road revealed as the only trap that had ever mattered. Fang Hong understood it in his last minutes, I'm told, that every careful step of his careful retreat had been herded, that Feng Jing had left exactly one road open, and it had led here. It was over before the sun cleared the eastern cliff, 100,000 men. The largest force Baekchuan had sent south in a generation, commanded by the best general the empire had, aimed with genuine care at my throat. Zhao Ling, captured. Qin Zhan, fallen. Fang Hong's 30,000, buried in a valley. The whole thing, gone, in the time it took my father's court to stop congratulating itself on sending it, and this one I had earned. This wasn't a proud fool feeding my legend. This was the real army, the real general, the real test, and I'd taken it apart with a poet's lie and a fortress, and 2 hands I'd summoned out of the noon air, and when it was done there was nothing left between the southern territory and the capital but distance. My people up north brought me the whole thing afterward, scene by scene, and I'll be honest, I read those reports the way a man rereads a letter from someone he loves, because 130,000 of my father's soldiers dead on my river was one thing. What that number did when it walked into the Golden Luan Hall was the thing I'd actually been building toward my whole life. It arrived on a half-dead horse. A deputy general named Wu Bing, one of the few Qin Zhan had ordered to run while he covered the retreat, rode his command into the ground getting to the capital and stumbled bleeding through the palace gate to gasp out 4 words that broke a dynasty's nerve: the 100,000, annihilated, Qin Zhan, fallen, and my father, the man who'd sat on his 9-dragon throne and handed me a death sentence with a smile, came apart in front of his whole court. He drew his own sword on the messenger. He screamed that it was a lie, that his military god could not have lost, could not possibly have lost, to that half-blood abomination he'd thrown away. They had to hold him back from killing the man who'd brought the news. That's the sentence my spies underlined for me, and I read it more times than I'll admit. How could my military god lose to that abomination? He still couldn't say my name, but he finally understood it was mine that had done this. And then the court did what that court always does when the blood is in the water. It turned on itself. Li Tao, the Grand Commandant, the war faction's own lord, the man who'd sworn on the floor of that hall that the South was a wasteland and the rebels weren't worth a single soldier, stood up to steady the room and found there was no room left to steady. His own colleagues rounded on him, who promised Qin Zhan would settle it in a month, whose disciples were named on 10,000 blood petitions, whose corruption drove a whole province into a rebel's arms. 40 years of untouchable power, and it came off him in a single morning like a coat, because the imperial court has exactly one loyalty, and it is to the winning side, and Li Tao had very suddenly stopped being it. They called for his office. They called for his head. My mother's ghost got her answer in the mouths of the very men who'd once helped him bury her, and I did not feel sorry, not for one heartbeat of it. My brothers, meanwhile, smelled the same blood and went hunting. The disaster in the south hadn't frightened them so much as opened a door. In 3 quiet residences on the same night, 3 princes made 3 different plays for a throne that had just shown a crack. My second brother, Su Xiao, went courting the border generals, whispering that the crown prince only knew how to beg for peace and that a real man would protect their interests. Xiao Rui went for the kill on Li Tao and, while he was at it, quietly started pulling threads on the crown prince's network too. and the crown prince, Xiao Qiang, sat over a cold cup of tea watching his father's certainty and his brother's ambition both slip loose at once and understood that the ground under the air was no longer solid. They feared me, all three of them, and they were grateful to me, all three of them, because the storm I'd raised in the south was the exact cover each of them needed to move on the others. I had, without lifting a finger, turned my father's sons into 3 knives pointed inward. By the time the shouting burned down, the reports on my father's desk told him the truth his pride couldn't argue with. The border armies were hollow. The treasury was dry. The good generals were dead or too far away. It was almost winter. There was, in plain terms, no army left to send south and no coin to raise one, and the son he'd exiled to die was digging his passes deeper by the day. So the emperor of Baeksuan, my father, who a year and a half ago couldn't be troubled to spend a single decree on my death, issued the most humiliating edict of his reign: all border states to full defense. Hold the line. Guard, at all costs, against the northward advance of the rebel Xiaoren. He'd gone from sentencing me in a throne room to bracing his whole empire against me, and he did it through gritted teeth with a promise to his ministers that come spring, he would have his revenge. Nobody in that hall believed the spring part. Neither did I. But he wasn't finished, and this is the part my people flagged in red, the part I've kept sharpened ever since. Because a proud man who cannot beat you in the open does not simply accept it. When the court had emptied, my father called his minister of war close and said very quietly the thing that told me exactly what the next season of my life was going to be about. Gather the shadow guards. I have matters to discuss. He couldn't send an army, so he was going to send knives in the dark instead. Fine, father. I've been surviving your knives since I was 6. Send them. I'll be building while they come. I stood on the wall of Nanjin Pass in the last of the light, looking north up the empty road, and for the first time in my life, the thing at the end of that road wasn't a threat coming down to collect me. It was a debt, sitting up there in a warm palace, waiting to be collected. I rode back into southern Anne in the last warmth of autumn, and the city that had first met me with a rotting post house and a sneer came out to meet me a different way. They'd built a tower over the gate and hung it with red silk. They'd laid new carpet down the main street. And they were there, all of them, packed shoulder to shoulder along the road, the farmers I'd summoned out of the long river of history, the merchants who'd come back, the artisans, the old men who'd wept at the gates the day I hung the parasites' names above them. When I came through the gate, they threw flowers under my horse and shouted a word I'd waited my whole life to hear anyone say about me and mean it. Long live His Highness. I want to tell you I stayed cold. I didn't. Somewhere in that crowd was a version of me that had stood in a marble hall a year ago and been handed a death sentence by a smiling father in front of a room that agreed I was worth nothing. And here was a whole city that had decided I was worth everything, and the distance between those two rooms is the whole story, and I felt it land in a place I usually keep the door shut on. I let it stay open, just for the ride down that street. Elder Kai rode beside me, and when I glanced over, the old man was crying openly and not bothering to hide it. And I thought about a woman in a cold palace who died certain her son would be crushed by these people, and I thought, you were wrong, mother. Barely, but wrong. Then I put it away, because there was work. That winter I did what I'd done all year, only now on a scale that would have stopped my father's heart. My point balance had climbed past 2 million and kept rising by 10,000 a day, because a happy, fed, growing country pays its ruler in the only coin the system counts. So I spent it. 600,000 more refugees, called out of the long river of history and waves. Farmers, laborers, whole families, poured into 3 provinces that had room for 10 times that. 500 rare masters, mining men who found iron and coal in the hills of Ling and lit the first smelting fires that region had ever seen. Water engineers who read the crisscrossing rivers of Q and turned them into fields and fisheries. Agronomists with rice that gave 3 harvests a year in the warm south. Seed that could feed an army. Grain by the million caddies. Iron farm tools by the tens of thousands. Fruit tree saplings. Fish fry. Building stone. A whole civilization's worth of the boring, essential things, dropped into the poorest corner of the empire and put to work before the frost broke. And under all of it, quietly, I built the thing the fields were really for: new drill grounds along the borders. The strong young men of a growing country trained into new legions with my system elites as their instructors. Walls raised, granaries dug, passes reinforced. The Southern Territory stopped being a place I was holding and became a place that could hold itself. The barren south I'd been exiled to die in disappeared that winter, under fields and canals and workshops and mines and children playing at village gates that had stood empty a year before. The dagger my father had thrown into a hole had grown a whole arm. Feng Jing counseled patience, and I gave it to him. No crown yet. No march north yet. Build the walls higher, store the grain deeper, let the South grow into a thing the Empire couldn't dig out with 10 armies. I'd won this whole life on patience. I could afford a little more, but I want to be honest with you about where it sat in me, because the retelling would be a lie without it. There was one last detail my people brought me that winter, and of the whole collapse, the emperors, the grand commandants, the knives coming out between my brothers, it's the one I savored most, because it was so perfectly stupidly them. The Southern Li, watching Baeksuan bleed itself white against a rebel it couldn't reach, decided it was the ideal season to send a bill, a mountain of silver, the price of not marching on an empire that plainly couldn't stop them. And the treasury was a dry well. So my father swallowed the last of his pride and asked his court, his nobles, his own sons to open their purses and help the dynasty pay. And my brothers turned even that into a game. The donation became a contest, not who loved the empire most, but who could outspend whom in front of the throne. My second brother, Su Xiao, emptied a fortune onto the pile, coin enough to make the whole court gasp, for exactly one reason: to make the crown prince, who couldn't match him, look small and poor and unfit in front of their father. The heir to an empire, humiliated over a charity drive by his own brother's purse, and a good part of the silver Su Xiao threw around so grandly never reached the ransom at all. It flowed quietly to a certain cornered old grand commandant, because a drowning Li Tao was still worth buying if you were a prince who might want a wolf someday. That was the empire my father chose over me. A dry treasury, a foreign dynasty holding it upside down by the ankles, and a nest of sons bidding on his throne over a donation box while the dynasty burned. They didn't need me to bring it down. They were doing it to each other, in public, and the province they'd all written off just kept growing, quiet and fed and patient, into the thing that would one day walk up the road and collect. None of that was finished. That's the thing I need you to understand about where I stopped. The southern territory was mine. The people were mine. The armies were mine. And every threat the world had thrown down that road had come back broken. But the debt, the real one, the one with a woman's grave and a decade of bastard and a smiling man on a 9-dragon throne at the far end of it, that debt was still sitting up there in the capital, unpaid, waiting. I didn't say it out loud. I've learned that much. Say a thing before you've done it, and it becomes a promise you owe the world, and I don't make promises I haven't already put a knife behind. So I didn't stand on my wall and vow to flatten the capital. I just stood there, in the last light, looking north up the empty road at the warm little palace where my father lay awake, and I let the quiet do the talking. You sent me to a hole to die, father. You should have made sure I did, because the useless prince you threw away has a country now, and an army out of the air, and 100,000 people who die for him, and a very long memory. And one of these seasons, when the walls are high enough, and the grain is deep enough, I'm going to come home, and there won't be a smile in the whole hall. Ask me how the story ends, and I'll tell you the truth. It hasn't. This was only the part where the world learned my name. The next part is where it learns to be afraid of it.